I was nobody. A background employee at a company gala, holding a glass of water while billionaires laughed around him. Then he stepped into a dark alley and saw his boss, one of the most powerful women in the city, being forced toward a stranger's car, terrified, unable to fight back. He had two choices: walk away and keep his job, or step forward and risk everything his daughter depended on. He chose wrong, or at least that's what he thought, because the next morning she called him into her office and she remembered every single thing. If stories like this hit close to home, you're in the right place. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next one. We post new stories every week that will stay with you long after they're over. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city and country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to the night that changed everything. The gala had been going on for 3 hours before Ryan Cole decided he'd had enough of pretending to enjoy himself. He stood near the back of the main ballroom, close enough to the bar that he could flag down a water refill, but far enough from the clusters of executives that nobody would feel compelled to make conversation with him. That was the position he'd learned to occupy at company events. Present enough to check the attendance box, invisible enough to leave early without anyone noticing. The Hartwell Logistics Anniversary Gala was exactly the kind of event that reminded Ryan how far removed he was from the world the company actually operated in. The ballroom of the Grand Meridian Hotel had been rented for the entire evening. There were ice sculptures. There was a string quartet that transitioned seamlessly into a jazz trio around 9. There were waiters carrying trays of champagne flutes that probably cost more per glass than Ryan spent on Emma's school supplies for a month. He'd worn his one good suit. The jacket was a year old and slightly too warm for the room. He'd noticed the sleeve starting to fray at the left cuff and had spent the first hour of the evening keeping that hand in his pocket. Cole, his manager, Dennis Park, had clapped him on the shoulder sometime around 8. "Glad you came out. Avery likes to see the whole team." "Wouldn't miss it," Ryan had said. That was a lie. He would have very happily missed it. But Dennis wasn't wrong that Avery Montgomery expected presence. She'd built Hartwell from a mid-size regional shipper into one of the top 3 logistics operators on the East Coast in under 9 years, and one of the things people said about her, one of the things that was quietly acknowledged by everyone from the loading dock supervisors to the senior VPs, was that she noticed who showed up and who didn't. Ryan had been with the company for 2 years. He was a corporate risk auditor, which was a title that meant he spent his days reviewing compliance documents, flagging potential liability issues, and writing reports that executives skimmed and then filed without reading. It was careful work, methodical, the kind of work that suited a man who had learned, over a long time and in places he didn't talk about, how to stay quiet and watch for problems before they became disasters. Before Hartwell, he had been a Navy SEAL. Before Emma, he had been someone who didn't think twice about walking into situations that most people wouldn't walk toward. That version of Ryan Cole felt like someone who had lived in a different body. He was 38 now, with a daughter who was 7 years old and obsessed with anything that involved space, and a 2-bedroom apartment in Queens that was clean and functional and cost him exactly 63% of his monthly take-home. Emma's school was good. Her after-school program was good. Her pediatrician was covered under the company plan. The math worked, barely, as long as nothing unexpected happened. He didn't take risks anymore. He couldn't afford to. So Ryan Cole stood at the back of a ballroom full of people who would never remember his name, watched the string quartet, nursed a glass of sparkling water, and waited for a reasonable hour to leave. He first noticed Avery Montgomery around 9:30. Not that she was hard to miss. She was the kind of presence that rearranged a room whether she intended to or not. 30 years old, which still struck Ryan as almost implausibly young for the position she held, though he'd stopped mentioning that observation to anyone after Dennis had given him a look the first time it slipped out. She wore a dark navy dress, her hair pulled back, and she moved through the room with the particular efficiency of someone who had been trained from a young age to treat social events like strategic operations. Greeting this person, introducing that one, pausing long enough to make each conversation feel important before moving on. She was good at it, that much was obvious. But around 9:30, Ryan noticed that the champagne glass in her hand was being refilled more frequently than it had been an hour earlier. He wasn't watching her specifically. It was just the kind of thing his eyes caught. Patterns breaking down, behavior shifting. He'd spent enough years cataloging exactly that kind of change in environments where missing it could mean something very bad. By 10:15, she was on her fourth glass that he could count, and there was something different in the way she was standing, a slight softening of the posture, a half-second delay before she laughed at things people said to her. That wasn't his business. He looked away and started thinking about whether Emma's science project was due Monday or Tuesday. Victor Hale arrived at the gala at 11:15. Ryan recognized him the way he recognized anyone important at Hartwell, from the annual report, which Ryan had read 3 times, because understanding who controlled the money was part of understanding where the real risks in any company actually lived. Hale was 56, broad-shouldered, with the polished, weather-resistant confidence of a man who had spent 30 years learning that enough money could solve most problems. He held a minority stake in Hartwell, which was not a small stake, and he had a reputation for believing that the financial leverage he carried entitled him to a certain level of access that wasn't written into any contract. Ryan watched him cross the room and find Avery. He watched the way Hale touched her elbow when he leaned in to speak to her. The way Avery's posture, which had been loosening all evening, changed in a different way, tighter, suddenly, but not composed, more like braced. Ryan finished his water, set the glass on a passing tray, and headed for the service exit near the east corridor. He'd done his time. He had an early morning. Emma had a weekend soccer game at 8 a.m. and would absolutely not let him oversleep. The service exit brought him down a short corridor and out through a steel door into the narrow alley that ran along the hotel's loading zone. It was the fastest way to the street, and at this hour the alley was empty, or should have been. The Mercedes was idling at the far end near the second loading gate. Black, recent model, tinted rear windows. The driver was in the car with the engine running, which was the first thing Ryan noticed, because it was a cool night, and there was no reason to sit idling unless you were waiting for something specific. He saw them before his eyes had fully adjusted to the dark. Avery was pressed against the brick wall, and Victor Hale was between her and the alley entrance, close enough that she had nowhere to move. Her heels were on the wet asphalt, and she was not steady on them. One hand was braced against the wall. She was saying something. Ryan could see her lips moving, but her voice was too low to carry. Hale's hand was on her arm, not her elbow this time. Above the elbow, gripping. Ryan stopped walking. For exactly 1 second, he ran through the calculation. Victor Hale was a man with significant influence over the company that employed him. Ryan had a daughter in Queens who needed his health insurance, his stable income, and his continued employment. The right move, the practical move, was to keep walking to the street and find a cab. Then Avery looked up. She didn't recognize him. He was pretty sure of that. He was a face in a building she moved through without registering at the level of risk auditor. But she looked up because she heard footsteps, and she was frightened. And when her eyes found him across that dark alley, what Ryan saw in them wasn't the polished CEO who had rearranged a ballroom without trying. It was just a person who was scared. Ryan changed direction. "Bob, excuse me." His voice came out even, which he was grateful for. "Mr. Hale." Victor turned. The grip on Avery's arm didn't loosen immediately. He looked Ryan over once with the particular contempt of a man who has never been interrupted by anyone he considered worth interrupting. "This is a private conversation," Victor said. "Right." Ryan kept his hands relaxed at his sides. "I understand that. I'm also going to need to ask you to step back from Ms. Montgomery." Victor's expression shifted from contempt to something colder. "And who exactly are you?" "Hotel security, seconded for the event." The lie arrived without hesitation, fully formed. "We got a call from one of the floor managers about an altercation near the service exit. I was also told the police unit that handles this block is 2 minutes out. They were already in the area for something else." It was entirely fabricated, all of it. Victor stared at him for a long moment. Ryan held the eye contact and did not blink and let the silence work the way he knew silence could work when you let it. "This is ridiculous," Victor said. "Probably," Ryan agreed. "Step back anyway." Something in the air shifted. Maybe it was the way Ryan was standing. Maybe it was the mention of police. Maybe Victor Hale, who had spent 30 years calculating risk, ran the numbers in that moment and decided this particular situation wasn't worth the exposure. He released Avery's arm. "We'll speak Monday," he said to her, the words landing like a warning. Then he looked at Ryan with something that was not quite anger and not quite curiosity, but somewhere between the two. He walked to the Mercedes, got in the passenger side, and the car moved down the alley without hurrying. Ryan waited until it turned the corner. Then he exhaled. Oh. Avery was still against the wall. She hadn't moved. One hand was still braced on the brick, and when Ryan took a step toward her, she made a small sound, not quite a word, and he stopped. "I'm not going to touch you," he said quietly. "You're okay." He's gone. She was looking at the empty alley where the Mercedes had been. "I know you," she said. Her voice was blurred at the edges. "I've seen you. You work in the risk compliance and risk auditing. Ryan Cole." He gave her a moment. "We should get you off the street." I didn't realize." She pushed off the wall and immediately compensated for a stumble she hadn't quite made yet, catching herself before it happened. "I had too much to drink." "Yeah. That's not—" She stopped. "I'm not usually—" "I know," Ryan said. He had no idea if that was true, but she needed to hear something steady, and that was the thing he said. She looked at him properly for the first time. He could see her trying to focus, trying to run whatever assessment she normally ran when she encountered a new variable in a situation. The assessment was visibly not working at full capacity. "You're not actually hotel security," she said. "No." That was a lie. "Yes." She processed that. "It worked." "It worked," he confirmed. Something that might, under different circumstances, have been a laugh moved through her expression and then didn't quite make it out. She pressed her fingers against her forehead. "I need to go home," she said. He got her a taxi. That should have been the end of it. Hand her off at the curb, make sure the cab had the right address, go home. That would have been the version of events where Ryan Cole made the sensible choice and kept his life exactly as it was. But somewhere between the alley and the front of the hotel, Avery had gone from unsteady to genuinely ill, and by the time the cab pulled up, she was in no condition to be put in a car alone with a driver she didn't know, and sent to an address that she'd given Ryan from memory, but that he wasn't certain she'd stated correctly. So he got in with her. He told the driver the address on Park Avenue that Avery had given him, twice, slowly, and he sat on the opposite side of the seat and watched the city go by through the window while she was sick into the paper bag from his jacket pocket that he'd quietly prepared 2 blocks back because he'd seen enough situations deteriorate quickly to know when one was about to. She apologized. "You don't have to," he said. "I'm your boss," she said, which came out slightly more despairing than she probably intended. "You're a person who had a bad night. It happens." She didn't say anything to that. The building on Park Avenue was the kind that had a doorman who remembered faces. The doorman's name was apparently Gerald, because Avery said, "Gerald, I'm fine, please don't call anyone," when they came through the lobby. And Gerald, who had clearly seen things in his years at that building, simply nodded and held the elevator. Ryan rode up with her, waited while she found the keys in her purse with the focused concentration of someone who understood that this was a task requiring effort. Got the door open. The apartment was large and quiet and almost aggressively clean. He had a strange, brief impression of a space that was lived in by someone who was very careful about what they let it reveal. "I'm all right from here," she said. He almost agreed with her, but she was holding the door frame with one hand, and the hallway to wherever the bedroom was seemed like a longer distance than she was going to find comfortable alone. "Is there someone you can call?" he asked. She looked at him. There was something in her face that was hard to read. Not anger, not embarrassment exactly. Something that had been true before tonight, and that tonight had just made temporarily visible. "No," she said simply. Ryan stood in the doorway of the most expensive apartment he'd ever been in his too warm suit with the fraying sleeve, and thought about his daughter sleeping in Queens and about the job he had probably destroyed in an alley an hour ago. He thought about the fact that he had an 8 a.m. soccer game to get to. "Okay," he said. "I'll wait until you're settled." He sat on the couch, the edge of it, not making himself at home, and looked at his phone. It was 2:10 in the morning. There was a text from the overnight babysitter, Mrs. Panagos from 4B, checking in. He typed back that he was running late. Sorry, everything was fine. He heard water running from somewhere down the hall. He thought about Victor Hale's face in the alley, the cold assessment in it, The particular way a man looked at you when he was already calculating what he was going to do to you later. By the time he left the apartment, quietly, locking the door behind him with the spare key Avery had, in a moment of slightly disoriented trust, placed in his hand and then apparently forgotten about, it was nearly 2:30. He took the subway home because he'd spent his last cash on the cab. His suit was carrying the evidence of a long, strange night. He sat in the empty subway car and stared at the tunnels rushing past through the window, and he thought, Monday morning, the badge probably won't work. He thought about what he was going to tell Emma about why things might be changing soon. He wasn't angry about any of it. That surprised him, a little. He'd done what he'd done in that alley because there had been no version of walking away that he could have lived with afterward. Not cleanly, not without it following him. It had cost him something, maybe everything. But the math on it had been simple, really, when it came down to it. You either stepped forward or you didn't. Ryan Cole had spent too many years in the dark knowing exactly which kind of man he was. He got off at his stop, walked the 4 blocks home, and let himself into the apartment without waking Emma. He sat at the kitchen table in the quiet for a while. Then he went to bed. The badge worked. Ryan stood at the turnstile on Monday morning and held his breath for the half second between swiping and the green light. And then the green light came and the bar released, and he walked through like it was any other Monday. He didn't exhale until he was past the security desk and into the elevator. The weekend had been strange, in the particular way that weekends get strange when you're waiting for something bad that hasn't arrived yet. He'd taken Emma to her soccer game Saturday morning. She'd scored once and missed twice, and argued with him on the walk home about whether missing twice negated the one goal, which Ryan said it didn't, and Emma said the math suggested otherwise, which was the kind of thing his 7-year-old said with complete seriousness that still occasionally stopped him cold. They'd eaten pancakes at the diner on the corner that Emma called the syrup place, because she'd never once ordered anything without extra syrup and saw no reason to start. He'd watched her talk about her school project, something involving the distance between planets, and whether the distances were fair, which was a concept Ryan couldn't quite follow but listened to with full attention, and had spent a lot of that Saturday morning simply looking at her face and thinking, whatever happens Monday, this was a good morning. Sunday he'd cleaned the apartment, done 2 loads of laundry, and checked his phone 40 times waiting for an email or a call that never came. Nothing from HR. Nothing from Dennis. Nothing from any of the numbers he didn't recognize that he'd been half expecting to ring. And now it was Monday, and the badge had worked, and Ryan sat at his desk on the 4th floor and opened his email and found nothing unusual. Compliance reports. A flagged invoice from the Cincinnati operation. A meeting request from Dennis about quarterly numbers. He was 40 minutes into pretending to read the Cincinnati report when Dennis appeared at the door of his office. Dennis Park was 51, methodical, and had a face that was almost impossible to read under normal circumstances. He had the look right now of a man who had been told something and was deciding how much of it to carry into the room. "You got a minute?" Dennis said. "Yeah." Dennis came in and closed the door, which he almost never did. He stood rather than sitting, which was also unusual. He looked at Ryan with the specific expression of someone trying to figure out how a situation was going to go before committing to a position on it. "I got a call this morning," Dennis said, "from Avery's office, her assistant, Carol." He paused. "She wants to see you, 11 o'clock. Ryan set his pen down. "Okay." "Ryan." Dennis stopped, started again. "I also got a call Friday afternoon before the weekend. From Victor Hale's office. His assistant said he'd be filing a formal complaint about an incident at the gala, involving a member of our team who interfered in a private matter." He looked at Ryan steadily. "I spent the weekend trying to figure out if I was going to have a conversation about termination this morning." The room was quiet for a moment. "I didn't interfere in a private matter," Ryan said. "I know that's your position." "It's not a position, it's what happened." Dennis looked at him for another long second. "Go to the 11 o'clock, he said finally. "And Ryan, don't volunteer anything you don't have to." He left without closing the door. Ryan turned back to the Cincinnati report and read the same paragraph 3 times without retaining a single word of it. Carol, Avery Montgomery's executive assistant, was a woman in her late 40s who had the particular composure of someone who had been managing powerful people's chaos for long enough that almost nothing surprised her anymore. She showed Ryan to the small waiting area outside the corner office at 5 to 11, offered him coffee, which he declined and disappeared back to her desk without further comment. The executive floor was a different ecosystem than the fourth floor. Quieter. Carpeted differently. The air even felt filtered in some distinct way, which Ryan knew was probably his imagination, but that he couldn't quite shake. Through the glass walls of the conference room across the hall, he could see the early signs of a meeting being set up. Someone arranging folders, another person testing a projector. At exactly 11, Carol opened the office door. "She'll see you now." Ryan had only been in Avery Montgomery's office once before, during his onboarding 2 years ago, when the company still had the previous CEO, and the corner office had belonged to a different person entirely. Avery had renovated it when she took over, stripped out the heavy dark furniture the old regime had favored and replaced it with something cleaner and more spare. The desk was glass and steel. The shelves held operational binders, a few framed documents, and exactly one personal object that Ryan could see. A small, slightly battered model of an old cargo ship sitting on the corner of the credenza like something that had been carried from a previous life. Avery was standing when he walked in. Not sitting behind the desk in the power position he'd half expected, but standing near the window with a coffee cup in both hands, looking out at the street below. She turned when the door closed. The woman in this office looked nothing like the woman in the alley Friday night, and also exactly like her. The composure was back, fully assembled. The dark hair was perfect. The charcoal blazer was the kind of understated expensive that took a minute to register. She looked at Ryan with an expression that was level and contained and gave away nothing at all. He waited. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She came around to her side of the desk and set the coffee down, but didn't sit yet. She looked at him from standing for a moment. Not an intimidation tactic, he thought, but more like she was still deciding something. "I remember everything," she said. "I want you to know that." Ryan said nothing. "I know some people in my position, in that situation, they'd have found it more convenient not to." She paused. "I'm not doing that." "All right," he said. She sat. She folded her hands on the desk. "Victor Hale filed a complaint with the board Friday afternoon. He's claiming that a Hartwell employee physically threatened him and intervened in a private business conversation at the gala in a way that constitutes grounds for immediate termination." "A private business conversation," Ryan repeated. That's the language he used. "He had his hand on your arm in a service alley at midnight next to an idling car." Something moved through Avery's expression. Not quite anger, not quite discomfort. Something that had been sitting with her since Friday and hadn't finished settling. "Yes," she said. "He did. And you couldn't leave." "No." The word was flat and quiet, and she clearly didn't like saying it. "I couldn't." Ryan waited again. He'd learned a long time ago that silence was one of the most useful things you could offer someone who was figuring out how to say something difficult. "I told you I remember everything," Avery said. "That includes what Victor was saying to me before you came out that door. What he was suggesting he could make happen if I didn't get in that car." She picked up the coffee cup, changed her mind, and put it back down. "He has 3 board members he's had in his pocket for years. 2 of them are on the compensation committee. He was under the impression that gave him a certain kind of leverage." "Does it?" "It did," Avery said. Past tense. She looked at him directly. "I spent Saturday pulling every piece of security footage from the hotel's exterior cameras. The alley has 2 of them. The footage is clear enough." Ryan absorbed that. "I called an emergency session with the board's ethics subcommittee yesterday," Avery continued. "As of 9 this morning, Victor Hale's access to the building has been revoked and his board privileges have been suspended pending a formal review. His complaint against you has been dismissed." The office was quiet. Through the window behind her, Ryan could see a plane moving slowly across a pale sky. "You move fast," he said. "I don't wait when I know what I'm looking at." She said it without ego, just as a statement of how she operated. Then something shifted slightly in her expression, a fraction of something that was harder to categorize. "The complaint being dismissed means your position here isn't in jeopardy. I wanted you to hear that from me directly." "I appreciate it." "Don't thank me yet." She picked up a folder from the side of her desk and set it between them. "I have a question I want to ask you, and I want an honest answer. I'm told you're the kind of person who gives those." Ryan wasn't sure who had told her that, but he kept his face still. "Go ahead." "Why did you get involved?" She held up one hand slightly before he could answer. I know the obvious version. Man sees a woman in trouble, man steps in. But you knew who Victor Hale was. You're an auditor, which means you've read the company's financial structure closely enough to know exactly what his stake means. You had every professional reason to keep walking. She looked at him steadily. So why didn't you? Ryan thought about how to answer that for a moment. Not because the answer was complicated. It was actually one of the simplest things he could have said. But simple answers had a way of sounding calculated when you delivered them in a glass office on the 19th floor, and he didn't want to sound calculated. I have a daughter, he said. She's 7. Her name is Emma. Avery waited. She's the reason I came to work here, the reason I stay in an apartment that's a little too small, the reason I wore the same suit to this meeting that I wore to the gala Friday because it's the only one I own. Everything I do because she needs stability, and I'm the only person providing it. He paused. When I came out that door Friday night and I saw what was happening in that alley, I didn't think about Victor Hale's board position, or my salary, or my health insurance. I thought about what it would mean if Emma were ever in a situation like that, and there was somebody nearby who saw it and calculated whether it was worth their trouble to step in. He stopped. He hadn't planned to say that much. Avery was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, which wasn't something he was used to. He was usually decent at reading rooms. So you stepped in for her, Avery said. For Emma, not for me. I stepped in because I wasn't able not to, Ryan said. The reason underneath it? Yeah, it was her. The office was quiet for a moment. Then Avery opened the folder. What was inside the folder was not what Ryan expected. He'd walked into this meeting braced for a polished thank you and a dismissal, warm, professional, the kind of conversation that closed a chapter cleanly, so neither party had to acknowledge it again. He'd been prepared for that. He understood how people like Avery Montgomery managed uncomfortable debts. You neutralized them quickly, generously, and with enough grace that the other person felt good about being paid off. What was in the folder was a job description. He looked at it, read the title twice, read the salary figure once, and then once more because the first time he wasn't sure he'd parsed it correctly. Senior Director of Enterprise Risk Management, Executive Floor, direct reporting line to the CEO. Compensation that was nearly 3 times what he was currently making. He looked up at Avery. This isn't a thank you, she said. I want to be clear about that because I imagine you're sitting there thinking it is. She leaned back slightly in her chair. I've been looking at filling this position for 8 months. We've had 3 candidates go through the process. None of them were right. You know why? He shook his head. Because the people who interviewed well were the people who'd learned how to tell me what I wanted to hear. They were good at managing risk on paper and useless the moment the situation got complicated. She tapped the edge of the folder. Friday night, you talked a man with significant financial power over my company into backing down from a confrontation using nothing but your posture and a lie you invented in under 5 seconds. You didn't panic. You didn't escalate. You read the situation, and you made a decision, and you committed to it completely. She paused. That's not a thank you hire. That's me recognizing that the person I've been looking for has been on my 4th floor for 2 years, and I wasn't paying attention. Ryan looked back down at the folder, at the salary figure. He thought about the fraying cuff on his jacket sleeve. You don't know me, he said. Not professionally. You've seen one thing. That's fair, Avery said. So let me tell you what I also know. I had Carol pull your personnel file this morning, your quarterly reviews for 2 years. Dennis Park is not a man who overstates performance, and he's given you the highest marks in your division every cycle. You flagged a supplier liability issue in the Memphis operation 18 months ago that, if it had gone unaddressed for another quarter, would have cost us somewhere between $2 and $4 million in regulatory fines. The legal team buried the citation in a footnote. You found it in a footnote. She met his eyes. And you didn't make a show of finding it. You just wrote it up in a report and sent it up the chain. No grandstanding. Ryan didn't say anything. I don't need people who perform competence, Avery said. I have plenty of those. I need people who actually have it. And I need people who will tell me the truth when everyone else in the room is calculating what I want to hear. She gestured at the folder. Take it home. Think about it tonight. But I want an answer by end of week. He picked up the folder. He should have said something measured, something professional, something that acknowledged the offer without appearing overwhelmed by it. That was the correct response in a room like this. Instead, what he said was, "The hotel security story. Was that what convinced you? Or the thing I said about Emma?" Avery looked at him for a moment with an expression that was almost, not quite, a smile. "The fact that you left my apartment without waking me up and locked the door behind you," she said. "That's what convinced me." Ryan did not tell Dennis about the meeting in detail. He said it had gone fine, that the complaint had been resolved, that he was keeping his position. Dennis looked at him with the expression of a man who suspected he was not getting the full picture but had decided not to press it, which was one of the things Ryan had come to quietly appreciate about Dennis. He took the folder home. Emma was at her after-school program until 5:30, which gave him 45 minutes in the apartment alone. He sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where he'd sat 3 nights ago thinking he'd destroyed everything, and read through the job description twice. He looked at the salary figure again. He did the math that he'd stopped himself from doing in Avery's office because doing math about money in front of the person offering it felt undignified. He thought about Emma's science program application, which he'd told her they needed to wait on. The advanced program. The one she'd showed him the brochure for in November and described in complete detail for 22 minutes, which he'd counted because it was one of the longer monologues she'd delivered, and he'd been genuinely impressed by her stamina for the subject. He thought about the apartment, about what a second bedroom would mean, about the fact that Emma was sharing a wall with his room and had been for 2 years and was at an age where she'd started wanting what she called actual privacy, which she'd defined for him as walls that don't hear everything, which had made him feel something he couldn't quite name. He set the folder on the table. He thought about Avery Montgomery's office, about the way she'd asked her question, not as a test, he'd decided, but as something she genuinely needed to know. The difference between those two things was small and hard to explain, but he'd felt it. He thought about what she'd said when he asked what had convinced her. The apartment. The door. The detail of it unsettled him slightly, not because it was wrong, but because it was accurate. He'd locked the door automatically, the way you locked a door when you were leaving someone's home and you wanted to make sure they were secure. He hadn't thought about it. He'd just done it, and somehow that unconscious thing had been the variable that moved her. He wasn't sure what to do with that information. He put it aside. He called Mrs. Panagos and asked if she could cover pickup that evening, that he needed to stay a little late at work. Mrs. Panagos said, of course, she'd already started the soup. Ryan thanked her and meant it. Then he went back to the kitchen table and looked at the folder for another 10 minutes. He accepted the offer on Wednesday. He'd spent Tuesday convincing himself he was going to ask for more time, which he then spent Tuesday evening recognizing was a delay tactic rather than a legitimate need for consideration. The offer was clear. The terms were good, better than good. The risk, as far as he could assess it, was real but not irrational. A new position always carried exposure. A direct reporting line to a CEO meant that when things went wrong, they went wrong visibly. He understood that. He also understood that the alternative, say, staying on the 4th floor, auditing Cincinnati invoices and writing reports that nobody read, was a choice that would look exactly the same in 2 years as it did today. And Emma was not going to be 7 forever, and the science program brochure was still on the refrigerator. He sent the acceptance email Wednesday morning, copied Carol, and then went back to the Cincinnati report that he still hadn't finished. Carol called at 2 in the afternoon to discuss the logistics of the transition. The move to the executive floor would happen over the following 2 weeks. Ryan would have a formal introduction to the leadership team at the Thursday morning executive briefing the week after. There would be a compensation adjustment effective from the prior Monday, which meant 2 weeks of retroactive pay at the new rate, which was a detail that Ryan had not anticipated and that he processed in silence while Carol kept talking. He thanked her and hung up and stared at his monitor for a moment. Then he allowed himself to do the math on the retroactive pay. He was very still for about 4 seconds. Then he picked up his phone and texted Mrs. Panagos that Emma could have extra syrup on her pancakes tomorrow if she wanted. Mrs. Panagos replied with 3 question marks. The executive floor was a different kind of quiet than what Ryan was used to. Not peaceful quiet, strategic quiet. The kind of quiet that comes from people who are very good at not showing what they're thinking. He'd lived in environments like this before. The military had its own version of it, where everyone in the room knew things, and the art was in knowing which things to show and which to carry without expression. This was the corporate equivalent. Same skill set, different theater. He was good at it. I was, in fact, probably better at it than most of the people up here, because he'd learned it in a context where reading the room wrong had consequences that made a bad quarterly review look like a footnote. His new office was smaller than he'd expected. A real office, with a door, but not a corner situation. He didn't care about that. He cared about the fact that it had a door, which meant he could close it when he was working through something complicated, which was all he'd wanted since the fourth floor. Dennis had shaken his hand when Ryan told him, had looked at him for a long moment with something that might have been pride and might have been something more complicated. Avery doesn't do this for people, Dennis had said. I know. Whatever you did to get her attention, keep doing it. He'd paused. Or don't. I don't actually know what you did, and I've decided I don't need to. The first 2 weeks on the executive floor were a process of calibration. Ryan said little at the leadership meetings, which he understood was not a strategy that would work indefinitely, but which he felt was appropriate when you were new and learning which information was real and which was performance. He watched who spoke and who listened and who did both simultaneously, which was a harder skill and therefore the one that usually revealed the most. He noticed, on his fourth day in the new role, that Avery ran meetings the way some people played chess, always 2 or 3 moves ahead of the conversation's surface level, asking questions that seemed straightforward until you realized they were designed to expose the gap between what someone was claiming and what the underlying numbers actually showed. She was, he decided, one of the sharper people he'd sat in a room with. And he'd sat in rooms with people whose sharpness had been, in some cases, a matter of survival. He noticed something else, too. She held people at a specific distance, not unkindly. She wasn't cold in the way that some executives used coldness as a management tool, but there was a perimeter, and it was maintained with such consistency that most people had probably stopped noticing it was there. She was present in every room but accessible in none of them. She asked about people's work and remembered the answers with precision, but Ryan never once heard her ask about someone's life outside the building. He recognized it. He'd been doing a version of it himself for years, though his version was quieter and probably less obvious because he was working with less raw force of personality. He didn't mention it to anyone. It wasn't the kind of thing you mentioned. It was the third week, a Thursday, 11:15 in the morning, when Emma entered the equation. The call came from the school administrator at 11:10. Ryan was in the middle of reviewing a stack of regional fuel expense reports that he'd requested after noticing a pattern in the Pacific Northwest Division's billing cycles that didn't sit right with him. He almost let the call go to voicemail, saw it was the school's main number, and picked up. The boiler in the East Wing had developed a dangerous pressure fault early that morning. The school was evacuating non-essential wings and sending home students whose classroom was in the affected area. Emma's second grade class was on that list. A parent or approved guardian needed to pick her up by noon. Mrs. Panagos was at a medical appointment. Ryan's backup, his college friend Carl, who was on Emma's pickup list, was in New Jersey for work and couldn't get back in time. Ryan worked through his mental list in about 45 seconds and arrived at the same answer every time. He was going to have to bring Emma to the office. He sat with that for a moment. Then he walked down the hall to Carol's desk. I have a situation, he said. My daughter's school is sending her home early. I don't have childcare coverage for the next few hours. I need to bring her in. He looked at Carol directly. I understand if that's a problem. I can work from a conference room on a lower floor. I can... What's her name? Carol said. Ryan blinked. Emma. How old? 7. Carol looked at him with the expression of a woman who had, over the course of a long career, managed far more complicated situations than a 7-year-old. Is she the kind of kid who can sit quietly with a tablet for 2 hours? She's the kind of kid who will ask you 17 questions first and then sit quietly. Fine, Carol said. Bring her up. There's a small conference room next to the supply closet that nobody uses on Thursdays. She can have that. Ryan said thank you. Carol said bring snacks because the executive floor's kitchen was stocked for adults, and she was not responsible for what a 7-year-old would make of the choices up there. Emma arrived at 12:40, wearing her school backpack with the small embroidered rocket ship on the front pocket and looking around the lobby of the building with the specific wide-eyed assessment she applied to new environments, which was something Ryan had noticed when she was about 4. She didn't react to new places immediately. She cataloged them first. It's very shiny in here, she announced, looking up at the atrium. It is, Ryan agreed. Is this where you work every day? I work on a floor that is less shiny than this. That seems like a design problem, Emma said. He got her settled in the small conference room with her tablet, her homework folder, and the snacks he'd picked up from the deli on his way to get her. The apple slices she'd eat without complaint, and the string cheese she'd eat first. He told her to stay in the room, not to touch the projector, and to text him if she needed anything, which she could do because she had an old phone of his with his number saved as dad work for exactly these situations. She pulled out a workbook, looked at him solemnly, and said, "You can go. I'm fine." He went. Well, I was back at his desk for 40 minutes, working through the fuel reports. The pattern was getting clearer, and not in a way he liked. There were 3 vendors in the Pacific Northwest cycle that didn't appear in any of the main supplier databases he had access to, which was the kind of thing that should have had an explanation already attached to it, when he heard the sound. It was a laugh. Specific and genuine, not polite meeting room laughter, but the kind that escapes involuntarily when something lands before you can arrange your face around it. It was coming from the direction of Avery's office. Ryan looked up from his monitor. He could see through the glass portion of his office wall that Avery's door was open, which it almost never was in the middle of a workday. And standing just inside the doorway, backpack still on, holding a string cheese wrapper in one hand with the focused expression of someone who has a very important question prepared, was Emma. Ryan was on his feet before he'd consciously decided to move. He was halfway down the hall when he heard his daughter's voice, carrying clearly in the executive floor's particular quiet. "But if you're the boss of the whole company, why is your office smaller than the lobby?" Ryan arrived at the doorway. Avery was sitting at her desk, and the expression on her face was something Ryan had not seen there in 3 weeks on this floor. It wasn't composed, it wasn't calculated. She was looking at Emma with what appeared to be genuine, unguarded startlement, and underneath that startlement was the very beginning of something that looked like it might become a real laugh if it was given another second to develop. "Emma," Ryan said, "I told you to stay in the conference room." Emma turned and looked at him with the expression she used when she believed she had a reasonable defense prepared. "I went to give back the room key because I was done with my homework." "The room doesn't have a key." "I know. I figured that out after." She turned back to Avery. "Sorry, I walked the wrong way." Avery, Ryan observed, had not recovered the composed expression. She was looking at Emma with the particular attention she applied to things that genuinely interested her. "It's a fair question," Avery said. "About the office." Emma brightened. "I thought so." "The lobby is designed to be impressive to visitors," Avery said. "My office is designed for me to actually work in. They're different things." Emma considered this seriously. "My teacher says impressive and useful are usually opposites." "Your teacher sounds like someone I'd want in a meeting," Avery said. Emma appeared to decide this was a satisfactory conversation and turned back to Ryan. "I finished my homework. Can I ask Carol if she has anything interesting for me to organize? She looks like a person who likes things organized." Ryan opened his mouth to say no. Avery said, "Carol does love organization." Emma looked at Ryan with an expression of absolute triumph. Ryan looked at Avery. Avery's expression had shifted again, back toward composed, but not quite all the way there. There was something at the edge of it that wasn't controlled, something small and genuine that had gotten through the perimeter before she'd had a chance to close it. She looked away first. "Go ask Carol," Ryan said to Emma. "Politely." Emma was already moving. Ryan stood in the doorway for a moment. "Sorry," he said. "She was supposed to stay in the conference room." "Don't be," Avery said. She was looking at her desk now, at the papers in front of her. Her voice had returned to its usual register, level, contained. But her hand, Ryan noticed, was resting flat on the desk rather than holding a pen or a file or anything purposeful, and she wasn't actually reading the paper in front of her. "She's a good kid," he said. "Yes," Avery said. "She obviously is." He went back to his office and the fuel reports. He sat down and tried to find the thread he'd dropped on the Pacific Northwest vendors, and found that it took him a moment longer than it should have to locate it, because part of his attention was still back in that doorway, on the specific look on Avery Montgomery's face when Emma had asked why the boss of the whole company had a smaller office than the lobby. The look that had lasted 3 seconds before she remembered to put the other one back. He filed it and focused on the fuel reports. The fuel reports were telling him something he was fairly certain nobody else on this floor had noticed yet. He was going to need to be careful about how he brought it forward. The fuel reports sat on Ryan's desk for 2 days before he decided what to do with them. Not because he was uncertain about what they meant. He'd been certain about that by the end of the first day, which was the uncomfortable part. The pattern was clean enough, once you knew where to look. And clean patterns in financial data were almost always worse than messy ones, because messy patterns happened by accident and clean ones happened on purpose. The 3 vendor names he'd flagged, Pacific Rim Fuel Solutions, Cascade Transport Services, and a shell listed only as NW Logistics Partners, LLC, appeared in the fuel expense records for Hartwell's Pacific Northwest Regional Division at intervals of roughly 6 weeks. Billing amounts that were individually unremarkable, but that, when aggregated across 18 months of records, totaled something in the range of $800,000. $800,000 paid to 3 companies that didn't appear in Hartwell's master supplier registry, that had no contracts on file in the legal system, and that, when Ryan spent a Thursday evening running their registered business addresses through state and corporation databases, appeared to share a single registered agent out of a law firm in Spokane that specialized, as far as Ryan could tell from its website, primarily in estate planning. Fuel vendors did not typically use estate planning firms as their registered agents. He'd sat with that for a while. The question wasn't whether something was wrong. The question was how wrong, and who knew about it, and how far up the structure it went. Those 3 questions were the ones that determined how you moved. Whether you walked this into your boss's office on a Tuesday morning, like a routine compliance finding, or whether you were more careful than that. Ryan had survived long enough in environments where the wrong move at the wrong moment had consequences that went beyond a bad performance review. He hadn't forgotten how to be careful. He spent the 2 days building a second layer of documentation, not because he needed it to be convinced. He was already convinced, but because when he put this in front of Avery, he wanted it to be undeniable, not interpretable. Not something that a good lawyer could describe as a coincidence or an administrative oversight. He wanted the kind of evidence that ended arguments rather than starting them. By Friday afternoon, he had it. He also had a problem he hadn't anticipated. 2 of the 3 shell vendor names appeared in expense approvals that carried the digital signatures of Hartwell's Pacific Northwest Regional Director, a man named Craig Fenwick, who had been with the company for 11 years and who sat on the Internal Operations Committee that reported directly to the CFO. That much wasn't surprising. Regional directors approved regional expenses. That was the structure. What was surprising was the 3rd vendor, NW Logistics Partners. Its invoices had been approved at a level above Fenwick, routed through the CFO's office, signed off by the CFO's deputy, and then buried in a subledger that wasn't part of the standard quarterly review package that went to Avery's desk. The CFO was Martin Greer. He'd been at Hartwell for 9 years, 4 of those as CFO. He was 62, steady, careful, universally regarded as one of the more reliable members of the senior team. Avery trusted him. Ryan had watched them in meetings. There was a specific shorthand between them that developed between people who had worked closely together through difficult periods. Ryan stared at Martin Greer's name on the approval chain for a long time. Then he closed the files, locked his office, and went to pick up Emma. He told her, on the walk home, that he was going to ask her an ethical question and that he needed her actual opinion, and not just the answer she thought he wanted to hear. Emma looked up at him with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether something was going to be interesting. Okay. If you found out that someone you trusted was doing something wrong, but telling people about it might hurt them, what would you do? Emma walked in silence for half a block. Ryan didn't rush her. What kind of wrong? She said finally. Taking something that wasn't theirs. Another half block. Were they taking it from you? From a lot of people. She thought about that. Then you have to tell, she said. Even if it's hard. Because if you don't tell, you're kind of helping them take it. Ryan looked at her. That's the logical conclusion, Emma added, which was a phrase she had apparently picked up somewhere and was now deploying with some regularity. Yeah, he said. It is. She seemed to sense that the question had a real context behind it, because she looked up at him again with a more careful expression. Is this about work? A little. Is it going to be okay? "I think so," he said. "I'm going to make sure it is." She appeared to accept that. She reached over and took his hand, which she still did when she was thinking about something, and they walked the last 2 blocks home like that. I went to Avery on Monday morning. He'd considered his options over the weekend with the same methodical attention he'd once applied to operational planning, laying out the variables, the likely responses, the ways things could go wrong. He could take it to the audit committee, which was the formal route and which had the advantage of process, but the disadvantage of giving Martin Greer advance warning through channels Ryan couldn't fully control. He could go to the board's independent director, which was cleaner structurally, but required Avery to find out through a third party that one of her senior executives might be dirty, which was not the way he wanted her to find out. Or he could go to her directly. He chose directly because it was what she'd asked for when she gave him the job. No lies. No managed information. The truth, even when the truth was inconvenient. He knocked on her open office door at 8:45 before the morning's first meeting. Carol was at her desk. Avery was at hers, reading something, coffee steaming beside her left hand. "Do you have 15 minutes?" he said. She looked up, read something in his face, set down the papers, closed the door. He walked her through it methodically. The vendor names, the registration data, the approval chains, the subledger routing, the total aggregate. He'd printed everything and organized it in a single folder, which he placed on her desk and then stepped back from, because some information needed physical space around it when you delivered it. Avery went through the folder page by page. She didn't speak while she was reading. Ryan had expected that. She processed information internally, which he'd observed across 3 weeks of meetings. What he hadn't quite anticipated was how still she became. Not frozen, not shutting down. Still in the way of someone who is running a complex assessment and has suspended everything non-essential until it's complete. When she closed the folder, she looked at it for a moment before she looked at him. "You verified the registered agent independently," she said. "You didn't use our legal department's database tools." "No, I used state and corporation records directly." "Because if someone in legal is aware of this structure, using our internal tools would have flagged your search." That occurred to me. She picked up the folder again and looked at the third section, the NW logistics approvals, the ones with the deputy CFO's signature. She turned to that page with the specific attention of someone who already knew what they were going to find and was verifying it rather than discovering it. "How long have you been sitting on this?" she asked. 2 days. I wanted the documentation complete before I brought it to you." "You didn't tell anyone else?" "No." She set the folder down again. She pressed her fingers flat against the cover in a gesture that seemed less like a physical action and more like she was steadying herself without allowing herself to show that she needed to. "Martin Greer," she said. "His name is on the approval chain. That doesn't necessarily mean—" "Ryan." Her voice was quiet and very level. "Don't soften it." He stopped. "His deputy doesn't route vendor approvals without Martin knowing. That's not how Martin runs his office." She wasn't asking. She was telling him what she already understood, even if understanding it was clearly costing her something. "Martin has been with this company since before I was CEO. He's been in finance since before I got here." She paused. "I trusted him." "I know." She stood up, walked to the window. The same window she'd been standing at the first morning she'd called him in. She looked out at the street for a moment with her arms folded across her chest, not hugging herself exactly, but something adjacent to it. "How much is real?" she said. "The 800,000 in the Pacific Northwest operation. Is that the whole picture or is that the part I can see?" Ryan had spent a significant portion of his weekend on exactly that question. "The Pacific Northwest operation is the only region where I have full access to the raw billing records in my current role. To assess the full scope, I'd need to run the same analysis across all 14 regional divisions. And I'd need to do it in a way that doesn't use any systems that Martin's office has visibility into." She turned from the window. "How long would that take?" "If I had the access and was doing it alone, a week, maybe less." "I can expand your system access without going through Martin's office," she said. "I can do it through IT directly, as a CEO-level authorization. It won't look unusual. Executive audits happen." "That would work." She came back to the desk. Stood rather than sitting, looking at the folder again. "The board's audit committee chair is Eleanor Voss. She's independent. She came on after I restructured the committee 2 years ago. She's not connected to any of the internal executive relationships. She picked up her pen, not to write anything, just to hold it. I want you to run the full analysis. When it's done, the three of us meet. You, me, Eleanor. Nobody else until that meeting. Agreed. And Ryan. She looked at him directly. If this is as wide as I think it might be, I need to know that you understand what you're walking into. These are people who have been in this building for years. They have relationships and influence that run through every layer of the company. This doesn't stay tidy. I didn't think it would, he said. She studied him for a moment. Most people, when they found this, would have thought very carefully about whether surfacing it was worth the professional risk, especially in your position. My position. New. Still building credibility up here, finding something that implicates a senior executive who's been here 9 years. There are people who would have filed it quietly in a drawer and kept their head down. Ryan thought about Emma on the walk home, telling him that if you didn't say anything, you were kind of helping them take it. That wasn't an option, he said. Avery looked at him for a moment with the expression that occasionally moved across her face when he said something that confirmed rather than contradicted whatever she was thinking. She didn't say anything. I'll have the full analysis done by end of week, Ryan said. I'll keep the files off the shared network. Use your personal laptop for the cross-referencing, not a company machine. Already planned on it. She nodded. He picked up his copy of the folder. He'd made 2, kept both, which she hadn't asked about but noticed, and went to the door. Ryan. He turned. Thank you, she said. It came out flat, which he suspected was not how she intended it. She made a small gesture that acknowledged the inadequacy of the word. For bringing it here, and for the way you brought it. You told me no managed information, he said. I took that seriously. The week that followed was the strangest kind of difficult. Outwardly normal, surface unchanged, while underneath it, Ryan was doing the most consequential work of his 2 months on the executive floor. Avery expanded his system access on Tuesday, processed through IT as a routine executive audit authorization. Ryan cross-referenced the access with his existing records and spent Tuesday and Wednesday evenings at the kitchen table with his personal laptop, Emma doing homework across from him at the same table, neither of them talking much, both of them working. On Wednesday night, Emma looked up from her workbook and said, without preamble, "You're doing the thing where you're here, but you're also thinking really hard about something else." "Sorry," Ryan said. "It's okay. I do that too." She turned a page. "Is it the work thing from before?" "Yeah." "Is it getting clearer?" He looked at his screen, at the spreadsheet that now covered 7 of Hartwell's 14 regional divisions. And that was telling a story he hadn't wanted to be true, but that was becoming undeniable page by page. "It's getting clearer," he said. Emma nodded and went back to her workbook. By Thursday evening, he had enough. Not everything. The full picture would take another few days, but enough to establish scope and pattern beyond reasonable doubt. What he'd found in the Pacific Northwest operation was not an isolated anomaly. Variations of the same structure appeared in 4 other regional divisions. 3 sets of shell vendors, similar approval chain routing, subledger concealment. The aggregate, conservatively estimated from the records he'd accessed so far, was somewhere between $2 and $4 million, and that was a conservative number that assumed the remaining 7 divisions were clean, which Ryan did not believe. He sat back from the laptop and looked at the ceiling of his kitchen for a moment. This was not an administrative oversight. This was a structure. It had been built deliberately, over time, by people who understood Hartwell's financial architecture well enough to design the concealment around its blind spots. Martin Greer had been CFO for 4 years. He'd had 4 years to learn exactly where the blind spots were. Ryan thought about Avery's face when he delivered the first folder. The stillness, the way she'd pressed her hand flat on the cover. He closed the laptop and went to check that Emma's nightlight was on, which was something he did every night, even though she'd told him twice she didn't actually need the nightlight anymore, which he believed, but he checked anyway. He briefed Avery Friday morning, before the building fully filled up. She listened the same way she'd listened on Monday. Completely, without interruption. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. 4 divisions confirmed and 5 more pending, she said, at minimum. And the aggregate. 2 to 4 million on the confirmed scope. If the remaining divisions follow the same pattern, the total could reach significantly higher. How much higher? I don't have a confident number yet, but the structure in the Pacific Northwest operation has been running for at least 3 years. If the other divisions have similar timelines, he stopped because she was already doing the math. It could be in the range of 10 to 15 million, possibly more. Avery stood very still. Call Eleanor Voss, she said finally. Today. Tell her I need a private meeting this weekend, not at the office. Tell her it's a material matter and that time is a factor. She'll understand what that means. Do you want me in that meeting? I need you in that meeting. She moved around the desk to her cabinet, retrieved a legal pad and a pen. I'm going to spend today reviewing the financial statements for the divisions you've confirmed. Not the summary documents, the raw inputs. If Martin's been managing the concealment at the CFO level, I need to understand exactly what he had access to and when. She stopped and looked at Ryan. This is going to get very ugly. Yes. There are going to be people on that board who will try to frame this as a failure of my oversight. They'll say the CEO should have caught this. They might? And you'll be the person who actually found it, which means your name will be attached to this going forward. She looked at him steadily. I want you to understand that before we go further. Ryan thought about that for exactly as long as it deserved. I understand it, he said. It doesn't change anything. She looked at him with the particular attention she gave to things that she was deciding whether to fully believe. Then she nodded, once, and turned back to her legal pad. The meeting with Eleanor Voss took place on Saturday afternoon in the private dining room of a members' club in Midtown that Eleanor used for sensitive conversations. Ryan had never been to a place like it, the kind of room where the chairs cost more than his monthly rent, and where the staff had clearly been trained to be completely invisible, which they managed with an accuracy that was slightly unnerving. Eleanor Voss was 68, small, silver-haired, and possessed of the specific quality of attention that came from decades of experience on audit committees for large organizations. She'd been a partner at a major accounting firm for 20 years before moving into governance work. She listened to Ryan's presentation. He'd printed a clean version of the summary documentation, 50 pages, spiral-bound, with her reading glasses on and the folder open in her lap, and not a word for 45 minutes. When she looked up, she looked at Avery first, then at Ryan. How many people know about this? She said. The 3 of us, Avery said. No one in legal, internal audit? No? Eleanor removed her glasses. The scope you're describing, if it's confirmed across the remaining divisions, is going to require external forensic accounting. We can't use any internal resource that has contact with Martin Greer's office. She looked at Ryan. How confident are you in the pattern? Not the total, the pattern. Completely confident, Ryan said. The structure is deliberate and consistent. This wasn't built by accident. And the board member connection? Ryan looked at Avery. This was the part they hadn't shared yet. The part Ryan had held back from the Monday meeting because he'd needed more time to verify it. Avery gave him a small nod. 2 of the shell vendors in the Pacific Northwest operation share their registered agent with a holding company, Ryan said. The holding company has 3 investors of record. One of them is a trust associated with Douglas Pratt. The room was quiet for a moment. Douglas Pratt was on Hartwell's board. He'd been there for 7 years, longer than Avery's tenure as CEO. He sat on the finance committee. Eleanor Voss looked at the folder in her lap. Then she looked at Avery. This goes beyond a financial misconduct matter, Eleanor said. If a board member is financially connected to the shell structure, that's a governance crisis. I know, Avery said. They're going to come at you the moment this surfaces. Pratt and whoever else is connected. They'll move to protect themselves by going after your leadership. I know that too. Eleanor studied her. You've already thought through the board response. I've thought through several possible versions of it. Avery's voice was level in the way that Ryan had come to recognize meant she was operating at full capacity and had decided not to show the cost of it. I'd like your assessment of which is most likely. Eleanor set her glasses on the table. She looked at the folder for a moment. If Pratt is connected, and if there are others we haven't found yet, they'll move first. They'll try to create a narrative before the external investigation has time to establish the facts. The typical playbook is to go after the CEO's judgment, poor oversight, missed warning signs. They'll claim you should have caught this earlier. They might find some support for that argument, Avery said, which was the most honest thing Ryan had heard her say in a meeting. I didn't catch it earlier. You didn't, Eleanor agreed, but the person you hired to catch it did. She looked at Ryan. How long have you been in the senior risk role? 7 weeks, Ryan said. Something moved through Eleanor's expression. 7 weeks, she repeated. He found it in the fuel reports, Avery said. The same reports that have been going through the CFO's quarterly review for 3 years. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and made a note on the cover of the folder. All right, here's what we do next. I'm going to authorize an external forensic review through the Audit Committee's independent counsel. I can do that without triggering an internal notification. It'll take 2 to 3 weeks to complete the full scope. During that time, you make no changes to Martin Greer's access or responsibilities. Nothing that signals we know. That's 2 to 3 weeks of potential ongoing diversion, Ryan said. I know. That's the cost of doing this properly. If we move on Martin before the external review is complete, we alert Pratt and whoever else is in this with him, and they have time to cover their tracks. Eleanor looked at him steadily. You ran this carefully, Mr. Cole. We finish it the same way. Ryan accepted that. He didn't like it, but he accepted it. The 2 weeks that followed were the most uncomfortable professional period Ryan had experienced since leaving the military. He sat in meetings with Martin Greer. He watched Martin review reports and make recommendations and interact with Avery with the comfortable authority of someone who had no idea the ground was already moving beneath him. He watched Douglas Pratt join a board call by video link on a Tuesday and make 3 substantive comments about Hartwell's financial governance that Ryan, sitting in the back of the room with his notebook, found nearly impossible to listen to with a level expression. He managed it. He'd sat through harder things without his face giving him away. But it cost something. What helped, more than he expected, was a conversation with Avery on a Wednesday afternoon that had nothing to do with the investigation. She'd stopped in the doorway of his office around 4:30. Not to start a meeting. She didn't have anything in her hands, no folder, no agenda. She just stopped. Emma's science program, she said. The advanced one she mentioned when she was up here. Did she ever apply? Ryan looked up from his monitor. The question surprised him enough that it took him a moment to shift gears. Not yet. I told her we'd look at the application after the semester break. The program fees are... He stopped himself because discussing the program fees in this context felt like a sentence he hadn't intended to start. Avery came into the office and sat in the chair across from his desk, which she'd never done before. She crossed her ankles and looked at him with the level, direct attention she gave things she'd already decided to say. I want to be clear about something, she said. What I'm about to say is not connected to the investigation. It's not a reward, and it's not a gesture. I've been thinking about it since before you brought me the fuel reports. Ryan waited. We have a corporate scholarship program that I established 3 years ago for the children of Hartwell employees. It covers educational enrichment programs, qualifying academic programs, advanced coursework, things of that kind. She held his gaze. Emma's program would qualify. The application goes through HR. It's completely separate from the executive relationship, and the selection is merit-based through an outside committee. She paused. I'm not offering to put my thumb on the scale. I'm telling you the program exists because it appears you didn't know about it. Ryan hadn't known about it. He processed that for a moment. She'd have to apply on her own merits, Avery said. Knowing Emma for approximately 45 minutes, I think that's probably not a problem. He looked at her. There was nothing in her expression that was calculating the effect of what she'd said. She'd simply said it and was now waiting for him to do whatever he was going to do with it. Why didn't HR mention this during onboarding? He said. It's in the benefits documentation, page 31. A slight pause. I'd guess page 31 of an HR benefits packet is not a universally well-read document. Ryan thought about that. About the benefits packet sitting in a drawer in his apartment, which he'd read through carefully on page 1 through about 12 and then skimmed the rest of. Thank you, he said. I'll look into it. Avery stood, straightened her blazer with the automatic precision of someone who'd been doing it for years. She was already turning toward the door when Ryan said, Can I ask you something? She turned back. He considered how to phrase it. You hold people at a distance up here. I don't mean that as a criticism. I do the same thing. But with Emma, in your office that first day, you didn't. You talked to her the same way you talk in a real conversation. He stopped. That's not usually how you are in this building. Avery looked at him for a moment. Her expression was doing something that he'd started to be able to read a little. The shift that happened when something landed closer than she'd prepared for. Children ask questions because they actually want the answers, she said finally. Most adults in this building ask questions to establish position. She paused. I find it easier to be honest with someone who isn't assessing the strategic implications of my response. She asked why your office was smaller than the lobby. And the answer was true and simple, and she accepted it. Something passed through her face that he didn't try to categorize. That's not a quality I encounter frequently up here. She left. Ryan sat at his desk for a moment after she'd gone, looking at the screen of his laptop without reading it. He thought about what she'd said, the thing about people asking questions to establish position. He thought about the fact that she'd come down the hall to his office at 4:30 on a Wednesday with no agenda and no folder, just to tell him about a scholarship program that was on page 31 of an HR packet. He thought about the model cargo ship on the corner of her credenza, the battered one that looked like it had been carried from somewhere else. He'd been curious about it for weeks and hadn't asked. He filed it and went back to work. The forensic accounting team from Eleanor's outside firm completed their preliminary scope report, 18 days after the Saturday meeting in Midtown. Ryan received a call from Eleanor directly. She didn't send the report through email. She called him on his cell at 7:15 in the morning while he was making Emma's school lunch. The preliminary numbers are in, Eleanor said. Full scope, all 14 divisions. Confirmed fraudulent vendor payments totaling $41 million over 4 years. 3 regional directors involved at the field level. 2 executives above the divisional structure. One of them is Martin Greer. 1 board member with a confirmed financial interest in the shell structure. Ryan set down the bread knife. $41 million, he said. The Pacific Northwest operation was the smallest of the 5 affected regions, Eleanor said. You were looking at the edge of it. He was quiet for a moment. Avery needs to know, Eleanor said. Can you get to the office within the hour? Emma was standing in the kitchen doorway in her school uniform, watching him with the careful attention she deployed when she understood something was happening that she wasn't being told. Give me 45 minutes, Ryan said. He finished the lunch. He walked Emma to the building door and waited until he saw Mrs. Panagos come down to take her to school. Emma looked up at him at the door with her clear, assessing eyes. The work thing, she said. It wasn't a question. Yeah. Is it almost done? He crouched down so he was at her level. Getting there, he said. Almost. She looked at him with the expression she used when she was deciding whether to ask a follow-up question. Then she reached forward and adjusted the lapel of his jacket, which didn't need adjusting, but which was something she did sometimes, and which Ryan had a theory about but had never articulated. Okay, she said. Go. He went. Ota. Avery was already in her office when Ryan arrived. Eleanor was on the phone with her. He could see through the glass wall that Avery was standing at her desk, not sitting, with her phone to her ear, and the expression that Ryan now knew meant she was processing something significant and had suspended the external version of herself while she did it. She ended the call when Ryan knocked. He came in and closed the door. She looked at him for a moment, just looked. 41 million, she said. Yes. 4 years. She set her phone down on the desk. I've been CEO for 5. This started 1 year after I took over. The implication of that sat in the room between them without either of them stating it directly. Someone in that structure decided that a new CEO was an opportunity, a period of transition, new oversight systems still being established. She pressed her lips together. They were right. The concealment was sophisticated, Ryan said. It was built around the blind spots in the financial architecture deliberately. That doesn't make me feel better. I know. I'm not saying it to make you feel better. She looked at him. Something moved through her expression, not gratitude exactly, but the particular recognition that passed between people who had agreed not to manage each other. Douglas Pratt is going to move the moment he finds out the external review is complete, she said. He's been on this board for 7 years. He knows how to maneuver. She picked up her legal pad. I need to get ahead of him. I need to be in front of the remaining independent board members before he has a chance to shape the narrative. Eleanor's already reaching out to 2 of them, Ryan said. She started last night. Avery stopped writing, looked at him. She started last night? She anticipated you'd want to move fast. She said to tell you she agrees with the instinct. Something crossed Avery's face that was somewhere between relief and the particular feeling of not being alone in a situation where you'd expect it to be. It lasted about 2 seconds before she pulled the composure back. But Ryan had seen it. He didn't say anything about it. "Sit down," Avery said. "We need to map the board positions before 9 o'clock." He sat down. They worked through it together. Who could be reached? In what order? With what framing? Ryan had never been in a strategic conversation quite like this one, where the stakes were simultaneously corporate and deeply personal for the person across the desk from him. He watched Avery think in real time, which was a thing he'd come to find genuinely impressive. The speed and the precision of it, the way she could hold 6 variables in active consideration and rank them without writing anything down. She was also, he noticed, slightly less composed than she usually was in these conversations. Not in a way that anyone who didn't know how to watch for it would see, but her hand moved to her coffee cup and back without drinking from it 3 times in 20 minutes, and she'd rearranged the same folder twice without opening it. And once, just once, she'd looked out the window in the middle of a sentence and taken a fraction of a second longer than usual to find her way back to it. She was afraid. Not the kind of afraid that paralyzed, the kind that clarified. That was a distinction Ryan understood better than most. "Hey," he said. Not executive to executive, just person to person. She looked at him. "This is going to go the right way," he said. "We have the documentation, we have Eleanor, we have the board positions mapped. They moved carefully, and so did we. The evidence is clean." He paused. "You're going to be okay." She held his gaze for a moment. "You can't promise that," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I've been in situations where the outcome depended on the quality of the preparation, and this is the best prepared I've seen a situation go into a fight." He held her gaze. "That's not nothing." She was quiet. Then she looked back at her legal pad. "Board positions," she said. "Let's finish the map." They finished the map. The board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday. Eleanor had moved quickly. More quickly than Ryan had expected, which said something about how seriously she was treating the situation. Within 48 hours of the preliminary forensic report, she had spoken privately with 4 of Hartwell's 7 independent board members. She'd been careful, she told Avery. She hadn't shown anyone the full documentation yet, hadn't made accusations, hadn't given anyone a reason to call Douglas Pratt and warn him that the ground was shifting. She'd simply asked each of them, in the careful language of someone who had spent decades in governance, whether they would be available for an urgent special session of the audit committee, convened at the committee chair's discretion on a matter of material importance. All 4 had said yes. That left 2 independent members she hadn't reached, and Pratt himself, who was the variable that kept Ryan up at night. Not because he was afraid of Pratt exactly, but because he understood that a man who had managed to sit on a board for 7 years while his name was connected to a $41 million fraud had not survived that long through luck. I was careful. He was probably also watching for signs that someone was watching him. Ryan said this to Avery on a Tuesday morning, standing in her office while rain tracked down the window behind her. "Pratt has been on this board since before your tenure," he said. "That means he's been through at least 2 major audit cycles, possibly more. He knows how the internal review processes work. He knows what triggers a flag and what doesn't." You're saying he might already suspect something," Avery said. "I'm saying I'd be surprised if a man in his position wasn't running his own threat assessment at all times. The moment the external forensic team started pulling records, even if it was done quietly, there's a chance he had a contact somewhere who noticed the access pattern." Avery was quiet for a moment. She was sitting at her desk with both hands around her coffee cup, which she'd been doing more frequently over the past week. Holding things, Ryan had noticed. The way people hold things when they need something solid while they're thinking. "How long do we have before the special session?" she asked. "Eleanor's targeting Thursday, 4 days. And if Pratt moves before Thursday?" Ryan had thought about that. "If he moves before we can get the documentation in front of the independent board members, he controls the narrative. The first version of a story is always the hardest one to dislodge." He paused. "We need to be ready to accelerate if anything changes. Define anything. If he calls an emergency board session himself, if he contacts any of the independent members directly, if Martin Greer does anything unusual, requests a meeting with Avery's office, changes his access patterns, moves files." He looked at her. I've asked IT to flag any unusual system activity from Greer's login credentials. They think it's a routine security audit. You set that up before I asked you to. Yes. She held his gaze for a moment. Good, she said simply. The call from IT came Wednesday afternoon at 3:47. Ryan was in a routine operations review when his phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He glanced at the screen. The IT security lead, a man named Paul Ortega, who Ryan had cultivated carefully over the past month in the way he cultivated most useful relationships, by being straightforward about what he needed and not wasting anyone's time. Ryan excused himself from the meeting. He was in the hallway when he answered. We got a flag on the Greer credentials, Paul said. His voice had the particular flatness of someone who was trying to convey urgency without broadcasting it in a shared workspace. 40 minutes ago, he accessed the Pacific Northwest Division's expense subledger, the specific subledger you asked us to watch. He spent about 12 minutes in there, and then he accessed the consolidated vendor payment archive. Ryan kept walking toward the stairwell, away from the executive floor's open layout. Did he copy anything? He asked. He ran 2 exports, PDF format, sent to an external email address, one of the personally registered domains we flag automatically for data loss prevention. The domain was registered 3 months ago. Can you trace the registration? Already did. Shell domain, registered through a privacy protection service in Delaware. But the email address it went to... Paul paused. The format matches a naming convention we've seen in 2 previous external communications from a contact in Douglas Pratt's office. Ryan stopped walking. You're sure about the naming convention match? I'm not going to tell Avery Montgomery's head of risk that I'm sure about something I'm not sure about, Paul said, which was the most useful thing anyone had said to Ryan in a week. Don't flag it internally yet, Ryan said. Don't let Greer know his access triggered anything. Can you preserve the export logs exactly as they are? Already isolated. I need copies in my hands within the hour, not on company email, printed from your workstation, and bring them to me directly. Yeah, Paul said. I'll be at your office in 45. Ryan ended the call and stood in the stairwell for a moment. Martin Greer had just sent documents to someone connected to Douglas Pratt's office, which meant one of 2 things. Either Greer had been spooked by something and was moving to protect himself by getting the documentation to Pratt, or Pratt had contacted Greer directly and told him to move. Either way, it meant the same thing in practical terms. They knew, or they were close enough to knowing that they were covering their tracks. 4 days had just become hours. He reached Avery by phone while she was in a call with a logistics partner on the West Coast. Carol pulled her out of it, which Carol did not do lightly, which told Ryan that Carol had read something in his face when he'd stopped at her desk that she'd correctly interpreted as not a routine interruption. What happened? Avery said, not a question. Greer accessed the subledger 40 minutes ago and exported documents to an external address connected to Pratt's office. He kept his voice even. They're moving. The line was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Where are you? She said. Outside your office. Come in. The next 4 hours were the most operationally compressed of Ryan's time at Hartwell, and he had enough experience with compressed timelines to know that the instinct to rush was the most dangerous thing in the room. Speed without structure was how people made mistakes they couldn't take back. He'd seen it in environments where the stakes were considerably higher than a board vote, and the lesson was always the same: move fast, but move right. Avery called Eleanor from her office, directly, on her cell. Eleanor picked up on the second ring. They've accelerated, Avery said. Greer moved documents to Pratt's orbit 40 minutes ago. I need the special session moved to tomorrow morning. There was a pause on Eleanor's end. Ryan could hear the particular quality of silence that meant someone was running logistics. 8 a.m., Eleanor said. My office, not the building. I'll reach the 4 confirmed members tonight. What about the other 2? I'll handle them personally, Avery said. Tonight. Avery. Eleanor's voice shifted slightly. If Pratt finds out about the session before it convenes, he's going to find out eventually. The question is whether he finds out before or after 4 independent board members have seen the documentation. A pause. I need tonight. You have tonight, Eleanor said. 8 o'clock tomorrow. Avery ended the call. She looked at Ryan. The documentation package, the full one, the version Eleanor's outside counsel prepared. Where is it? I have the complete set in a locked file on my personal laptop and a hard copy in my apartment. I need it tonight. The printed version. All of it. She stood and moved to her cabinet, pulling her coat from the hook inside the door. I'm going to reach the 2 remaining independent members personally. I need the package to take with me. I'll get it, Ryan said. Give me 90 minutes. I'll have Carol arrange a car. I have a car. He stopped. I mean, I'll take the subway. It's faster at this hour. I'll meet you at Eleanor's building in 90 minutes. Avery looked at him for a brief moment with the expression that surfaced when he said something that reminded her she'd been thinking of him as a person who existed primarily in an office. Then she let it go. 90 minutes, she said. Oh, I took the express train. He was back at his apartment in 38 minutes, which was faster than he'd calculated, and which required him to run the last 2 blocks in a way that he was grateful no one he knew witnessed. He got the hard copy from the locked drawer in his bedroom. The accordion folder, 214 pages of forensic findings, cross-referenced billing records, corporate registration documents, and approval chain documentation, all organized by Eleanor's outside counsel with the specific ruthlessness of people who made their living building airtight cases. He was back on the train in 12 minutes. He made it to Eleanor's building on Lexington with 4 minutes to spare, which meant he was standing in the lobby catching his breath when Avery arrived by car 3 minutes later. She looked at the accordion folder under his arm. You ran, she said. The last 2 blocks, yeah. Something moved through her expression that didn't quite become anything defined. She held the door for him, which he suspected she didn't even notice she'd done. Eleanor's office occupied the top floor of a brownstone she'd converted years ago into a governance consulting firm. The 2 remaining independent board members, a woman named Patricia Hoang and a man named Robert Stein, were already there when Ryan and Avery arrived, which meant Eleanor had reached them fast and they'd come without knowing exactly what they were walking into, which said something about how much they trusted Eleanor Voss. Ryan distributed the documentation packages while Avery introduced the situation. He watched the faces of the 2 board members as Avery spoke, the particular moment when someone moves from listening politely to actually listening, the shift in the eyes, the small adjustment in posture. Both of them hit that moment within the first 5 minutes, and after that the room was very still in the way of people who understood that they were in the middle of something significant. Patricia Hoang was the one who spoke first. She was 60, precise, and had the manner of someone who had served on enough boards to have seen most varieties of corporate misconduct. She looked at the forensic summary and then at Avery and said, "How long has Douglas Pratt been aware of the investigation?" "We believe as of this afternoon," Avery said, "and he's had access to this board for 7 years." "Yes," Patricia tapped the folder. "In my experience, men like Pratt don't wait. If he knows an investigation is imminent, he's already drafting the countermove." She looked at Eleanor. "What's the procedure for calling a vote on a board member's suspension pending investigation?" "It requires a majority of independent members," Eleanor said. 6 of 7, excluding Pratt as the subject of the investigation. With tonight's 4 plus the 2 of you, we have the votes. "Then we vote at the 8 o'clock session," Robert Stein said. He was quieter than Patricia, the kind of quiet that sat in a room with weight rather than absence. He'd been looking at the approval chain documentation for the past 10 minutes with the focus of someone reading something he would need to recall precisely later. "We also need to address Martin Greer's access before tomorrow morning. If he moved documents today, there's a risk he moves again overnight." Ryan looked at Avery. She looked at him. "I can have it revoke Greer's system credentials tonight," Ryan said, framed as a routine security audit precaution triggered by the flag on his access pattern. "It gives us a legitimate process basis, and it doesn't look like retaliation." "Do it," Avery said. He stepped to the corner of the room and called Paul Ortega. Paul answered in one ring, which meant he'd been waiting. "The Greer credentials," Ryan said. "Suspend them tonight. Log it as a data security precaution under Section 12 of the IT policy. Flag triggered by unusual external data transfer. Make sure the log entry is time-stamped before 9 p.m. "I can do that in the next 20 minutes, Paul said. "Do it now, and Paul—" Ryan paused. "Thank you. I mean it." "Just make sure this lands right," Paul said, and hung up. Ryan returned to the main group in time to hear Avery finishing her answer to a question from Robert Stein about whether the forensic team's findings would withstand a legal challenge. "They're airtight," she said. I've reviewed the methodology personally. There's no good faith interpretation of the data that doesn't point to deliberate fraud. Pratt will dispute the board member connection, Patricia said. He'll claim the trust association with the shell company is coincidental or a third-party relationship he had no knowledge of. He can claim whatever he wants, Avery said. The documentation establishes the financial chain. The forensic team has traced 5 wire transfers through 3 intermediary accounts. 2 of those accounts have co-signatories that trace back to a holding company where Pratt is the named majority owner. She paused. His lawyers will have a long week. The room was quiet for a moment. Eleanor looked at the clock on the wall above her desk. It was 9:40. We've covered everything we need for tonight. 8 o'clock tomorrow, everyone should be here by 7:50. I'll have the formal vote documentation prepared by morning. She looked at Avery. Get some sleep. Avery did not visibly react to that suggestion in a way that suggested she found it realistic, but she said nothing. The car that had brought Avery was waiting outside. Ryan had been planning to take the subway back to Queens. It was late, but the trains were still running, and the cost of a car service at this hour was not something he was going to put on the company account for a trip to his own apartment. He'd already calculated the route in his head. Avery stopped on the sidewalk outside Eleanor's building. I'll drop you, she said. I'm fine on the subway. It's almost 10 o'clock. I've taken the subway at 10 o'clock before. She looked at him with the specific expression she used when she'd already decided something and was waiting for the other person to stop making the conversation longer than it needed to be. Get in the car, Ryan, she said. He got in the car. The ride to Queens took 22 minutes, which was longer than the subway would have taken, but quieter in a way that the subway never was. The city moved past the windows, the lit windows of apartment buildings, the corner bodegas, the stretches of street that turned residential and then commercial and then residential again as they crossed into the borough. They didn't talk much for the first part of the ride. Ryan had the accordion folder on the seat between them, which he'd been holding on to since his apartment with the particular attention he gave things he didn't want to lose. He was also tired in a way that had settled into his shoulders and wasn't going anywhere soon. You're thinking about tomorrow, Avery said. I'm thinking about whether Pratt makes a move tonight, Ryan said. He knows the session is coming. If he's smart, and he is, he's looking at his options. What options does he have at this point? He could try to call an emergency board session himself tonight, preemptive strike, set the narrative before we can present the documentation. It's a long shot because he doesn't have the votes for it, but it would create noise and confusion that could slow us down. Eleanor anticipated that. She has a hold notification ready to send to all board members if anything unusual is attempted tonight. I know. I'm not worried about the board procedure. He looked at the city going by. I'm thinking about the other kind of move, the kind that doesn't go through official channels. The car was quiet for a moment. You think he'd try to interfere with the process, Avery said. I think a man who's been running a $41 million fraud inside a company for 4 years, and who has just discovered that the evidence is in the hands of the audit committee, is a man with limited options and a strong motivation to find new ones. He paused. I'm probably being too cautious. You've been cautious about everything in this process, Avery said. That's why we're in a car with complete documentation going to a board session tomorrow, instead of managing a crisis that got ahead of us. She looked at him. I'd rather have too cautious than not enough. He accepted that. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something he hadn't expected. My father ran a small shipping company, not like Hartwell. He had 3 trucks and a warehouse in New Jersey, and he worked 16-hour days for 20 years. She was looking at the window, not at him. I grew up doing the books with him on Saturday mornings. I was maybe 10 the first time he showed me how to read a freight manifest. Ryan waited. He had a business partner for the first 8 years, a man named Garrett, who he trusted completely, who was, as it turned out, moving money out of their joint account for the last 3 of those 8 years. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. She paused. My father found out when the bank called about an overdraft. By then it was enough that the company almost didn't survive. The car turned onto Ryan's block. He should have caught it earlier, Avery said. Her voice was even, but there was something underneath it that had been carried a long time. He trusted someone he shouldn't have trusted that completely. I watched what it did to him. Not just the financial damage, but the specific damage of finding out that someone you believed in had been taken from you for years while you were working next to them every day. Ryan looked at her. Is that why you hold people at a distance in that building? She turned from the window. He thought he'd pushed too far, but she held his gaze without pulling back. Probably, she said, among other reasons. The car stopped in front of his building. The street was quiet, the particular quiet of a residential block in Queens, at 10:30 on a weeknight. Ryan could see the light on in 4B, Mrs. Panago, still awake, probably watching the television program she watched every Wednesday that she'd told him about twice, and that he'd forgotten the name of both times. He picked up the accordion folder. Thank you, he said, for telling me that. I don't usually, she said, which was the most honest version of your welcome he'd heard from her. He got out of the car, stood on the sidewalk. The car didn't move immediately, which he noticed. He went inside. He checked on Emma, asleep, the nightlight on despite what she'd said about not needing it, her school backpack by the door already packed for tomorrow, in the methodical way she prepared for things she cared about. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at her. Then he went to the kitchen and sat at the table with the accordion folder and his laptop and spent the next 2 hours doing the thing he'd been putting off, building the contingency plan for every scenario he could imagine Pratt attempting tomorrow. Not because he thought Eleanor hadn't already covered this. She had. But Ryan Cole had spent a significant portion of his adult life in environments where plans were the things you built, so you had something to abandon intelligently when reality arrived. The planning itself was the value. It changed how your brain organized the information, made the unexpected less disorienting when it came. He went to bed at 12:40. He slept for 5 hours, which was more than he'd expected. The special session of the audit committee convened at 8:03 the following morning in Eleanor Voss's conference room, which was smaller and quieter than the Hartwell boardroom, and which, Ryan had decided, was exactly the right place for this. 6 independent board members. Eleanor as committee chair. Avery present as CEO. Ryan present as the executive whose findings had initiated the investigation. Douglas Pratt had received formal notice of the session at 7:45. Legal requirement, Eleanor had explained. You couldn't exclude a board member from notification even when they were the subject of the proceeding. But notification 18 minutes before a session started was legally sufficient and practically designed to prevent effective interference. Pratt had not appeared. He'd had his attorney call Eleanor's office at 7:52, which Eleanor's assistant had logged and set aside. The session ran for 2 hours and 11 minutes. Ryan presented the documentation in the order Eleanor had recommended. Establish the financial pattern first, then the approval chain, then the board member connection. Keep the argument structural. Don't editorialize. Let the numbers make the case. He'd done enough briefings in his previous life to know how to stand in a room and deliver difficult information to people who needed to act on it. He kept his voice level and his language precise, and he answered every question directly, including the ones that were uncomfortable, including Patricia Hoying's careful question about whether there was any innocent explanation for the shell vendor structure that the forensic team had considered and ruled out. They considered it, Ryan said. The documentation of that process is on pages 47 through 51 of the package. The conclusion was that the structure is incompatible with any legitimate business purpose. The concealment was intentional. The room was quiet. Robert Stein asked one question toward the end that wasn't about the documentation. Mr. Cole, he said, you've been in this senior role for, 2 months? Approximately. And you found this in the fuel reports? Yes. How did you find it? Ryan thought about how to answer that. I noticed that 3 vendor names appeared in billing records without appearing in any of the standard supplier databases I had access to. That was the first flag. Once I had the first flag, I knew what to look for in the adjacent records. Stein looked at him for a moment. The CFO's office would have reviewed those same billing records quarterly. Yes. And they didn't flag it. No, Ryan said. They didn't. The implication of that sat in the room without anyone stating it directly, which was the correct way to leave it. The vote to suspend Douglas Pratt's board privileges pending. The formal investigation took 4 minutes to conduct and was unanimous across all 6 independent members present. A second motion, authorizing the engagement of outside legal counsel to pursue a formal fraud investigation involving Martin Greer, the 3 regional directors identified in the forensic report, and any additional parties identified through ongoing discovery, passed with equal unanimity. A third motion, affirming Avery Montgomery's authority as CEO and confirming the board's confidence in her leadership during the period of the investigation, was proposed by Patricia Huang without prior coordination with anyone, which Ryan suspected was deliberate on Patricia's part. It passed in under 2 minutes. When the session ended, Eleanor spoke to Avery privately in the corner of the conference room while the other members gathered their things and moved in 2s and 3s toward the door. Ryan stood near the window and watched the street below. A delivery truck double-parked, a man walking a dog that didn't want to walk, an ordinary Thursday morning in the city, completely indifferent to what had just happened in this room. He was aware of a specific kind of tiredness that wasn't physical exhaustion, but something else, the particular flatness that came after you'd been carrying something at high tension for a sustained period and had just been allowed to set it down. Avery crossed the room toward him after Eleanor finished. She looked different than she had in the past 3 weeks. Not relaxed. That word didn't apply to her in any situation he'd observed. But something had shifted in the set of her shoulders, some load distributed differently. "It's done," she said. "The board part," he said. "The legal process is going to take time." "I know, but this was the part that could have gone the other way." She looked at him directly. "You built this. The methodology, the documentation, the way you sequenced it today. That's what held the room." "Eleanor held the room," Ryan said. "I handed her the right materials." "Don't do that," Avery said. He looked at her. "Don't minimize it. I've watched people minimize their own work in this company for 9 years, and it never serves them. It didn't serve them, and it's not going to serve you." She held his gaze without blinking. "You found $41 million in a fuel report on your 2nd month on this floor. You built the case without tipping off the people running the fraud. You stood in that room this morning and answered every question without hedging or managing the answer. That's not handing someone materials." She paused. "Take the credit." Ryan was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "Good." She looked at him for another beat and then looked out the window at the same street he'd been looking at. The delivery truck, the reluctant dog, the ordinary morning continuing without them. "I need to get back to the building," she said. "There's going to be a significant volume of management to do today. HR, legal, communications. The story is going to get out eventually, and I need to be ahead of it. Do you need me there?" "Yes." She said it without hesitation. "But not immediately. Go home first." He looked at her. "Emma had school today," she said. "She's been home with Mrs. Panagos every evening this week. Go be somewhere other than work for a few hours." The corner of her mouth moved very slightly. "The company will survive 3 hours without you." He thought about arguing with that on efficiency grounds and decided against it. 2 hours, he said. "Fine," she said. 2 hours. I took the subway back to Queens. It was 10:40 in the morning, the cars not crowded, the particular in-between hour when the city's transit moved at a different rhythm than rush hour. He sat with the accordion folder on his lap, and the particular silence of someone who had been operating at full capacity for 3 weeks and was only now beginning to feel the cost of it. He thought about Avery's voice in the car last night, the things she'd told him about her father and Garrett, and the Saturday mornings doing the books. He thought about why she'd told him that, and the specific context that had produced it. The darkness of the car, the lateness of the hour, the city going past. He thought about the way she'd said take the credit. Not as a kindness, as a correction. The distinction mattered to him more than he expected it to. He got off at his stop and walked the 4 blocks home through a morning that was cool and clear and bright in the specific way of October days that had decided to be generous. He unlocked the apartment door and stood in the quiet kitchen for a moment. Emma's workbook was still on the table from last night. Her school supplies were organized beside it, with the careful order she maintained in her own space, which she'd developed entirely independently, and which Ryan had never commented on because he recognized it as her version of something he did too. He made coffee. He stood at the counter and drank it while it was still too hot, which he did when he was tired and had stopped being careful about small things. He thought about Avery's office tonight, the volume of management she'd described, the fact that she would be doing it alone, or as close to alone as a CEO ever was, which was a different thing than actually having someone in the room. He thought about the cargo ship model on the corner of her credenza, the battered one. He'd never asked about it, and the moment for asking it casually had probably passed, which was a small thing, and also, somehow, not a small thing. He finished the coffee. He called Mrs. Panagos and said he'd be picking Emma up from school himself today. Mrs. Panagos said good. She'd been meaning to tell him Emma had asked 3 times this week when he was going to pick her up, which he hadn't known, and which sat in his chest in a way that was complicated. He went to the school at 3:15 and waited at the gate with the other parents. Emma came out of the building with her backpack and her rocket ship patch and her expression of someone cataloging the world, and when she spotted him at the gate, the look that crossed her face was one of the cleaner things Ryan had seen all week. She ran the last 10 yards. He caught her. "You're early," she said, slightly muffled against his jacket. "I had a good morning," he said. She leaned back and looked at him with the 7-year-old's version of assessment, the work thing. "It went well." "I told you it would," she said, with the absolute confidence of someone who had not technically said that, but who was not going to let accuracy interfere with the satisfaction of being right. He laughed, which surprised him. He took her hand and they started walking, and she talked about her day with the unedited momentum of someone who had been saving things to say, and Ryan listened to all of it, every word, with the full attention of a man who had remembered, sometime in the last 3 weeks, exactly what he was doing all of this for. The 2 hours Ryan had promised Avery became 3, because Emma wanted to stop at the syrup place and Ryan couldn't find a reason to say no. They sat in the corner booth, Emma with her pancakes and extra syrup, and Ryan with coffee he didn't need but ordered anyway. And she told him about a disagreement she'd had with her friend Marcus about whether Pluto deserved to be a planet, which she felt strongly it did, on the grounds that size should not be the determining factor in whether something mattered. Ryan listened to the full argument, which was more developed than he expected. "You're right," he said when she finished. Emma looked at him with mild suspicion. "You always say I'm right." "You're usually right." "That's different from always." "Fair point," he said. She ate her pancakes with the focused satisfaction of someone who had been thinking about them for a while, and Ryan drank his coffee and watched the street through the diner window and let the afternoon be what it was, unhurried, ordinary, the specific kind of good that doesn't announce itself. He got to the office by 2. The building felt different when he walked in. Not physically different, but the particular atmospheric quality of a place where significant information has begun moving through the walls. He could feel it in the elevator, the slightly elevated alertness in the faces of the people who got on and off, the way conversation stopped a beat too quickly when the doors opened. Carol met him at the elevator on the executive floor. "She's been asking where you were," Carol said, which was Carol's version of "you should have been here sooner." "I had 2 hours," Ryan said. "It's been 3.5. He didn't argue with the math. Avery's office was full when he got there. Not physically crowded, but populated with the kind of urgent purposefulness that meant multiple things were in motion simultaneously. Her general counsel, a woman named Diane Marsh, was at the small conference table inside the office with 2 associates Ryan didn't recognize. Avery was on the phone behind her desk, and she looked up when Ryan appeared in the doorway with an expression that was not quite relief, but was in that general territory. She ended the call inside of 30 seconds. "Diane," she said, "give us 10 minutes." Diane gathered her papers and moved her associates to the conference room across the hall with the efficient flexibility of someone who had done this before. The office emptied. Avery looked at Ryan. She had the look of someone who had been operating at full capacity since the session ended and had not had a moment to process any of it, which he recognized because he'd seen it on his own face in mirrors after long operational periods. "How bad is it?" he said. "It's manageable. It's a lot, but it's manageable." She sat down, which was the first time he'd seen her sit in a meeting without it being a deliberate positional choice. She sat because she was tired, which she would never have said out loud, but which her body said plainly. Legal is managing the regulatory notifications. We're required to self-report to the SEC within 4 business days of the board's determination. Diane has that drafted. The 3 regional directors in the affected divisions have been placed on administrative leave pending HR review. She paused. Martin Greer resigned this morning. Ryan stilled. He resigned before the session concluded? He submitted the letter at 7:48. 13 minutes before the session started. She looked at the desk, which means someone told him last night that the session was happening. The room was quiet. Not Eleanor's office, Ryan said. She was airtight. I know, I'm not suggesting Eleanor. She pressed her fingers against the edge of her desk. Pratt had contacts in this building for 7 years. One of them picked up a signal somewhere and passed it to Martin. She paused. It doesn't change the outcome. A resignation doesn't halt the legal process. Diane confirmed that. If anything, a resignation the morning of the session is going to look exactly like what it is. And Pratt? His attorney contacted Eleanor at 9:05 to begin negotiating the terms of his board departure. The corner of her mouth moved without becoming anything warmer. His attorney used the phrase mutually agreeable resolution, which is the legal equivalent of please don't make this worse than it needs to be. Ryan thought about that. He's going to try to settle. He's going to try to make the board member connection as quiet as possible. His attorney will argue that the trust relationship with the shell companies was managed by a third party and that Pratt had no direct knowledge of the fraudulent purpose. That argument is going to fail. Diane thinks it fails too, but it might take 18 months of litigation to prove that. She looked up at him. I want to be honest with you about the timeline. The board outcome was fast. The legal process is not going to be. There will be depositions, discovery, probably a period where the company is under heightened regulatory scrutiny. It's going to be present in this building for a long time. I know, Ryan said. I wasn't expecting it to be clean. She studied him for a moment. Most people would have expected a clean resolution. The board voted, the bad actors are gone, it's over. It's not over, it's entered a different phase. He held her gaze. That's fine. Different phases have different requirements. Something in her expression shifted. The particular shift he'd been watching for 3 months, the one that happened when he said something that landed in a place she'd been keeping carefully unoccupied. She looked at her desk. Victor Hale's attorney also reached out this morning, she said. His board complaint, the one he filed against you the night after the gala, has been formally withdrawn. Ryan had almost forgotten about that. It felt like a different chapter of something, the gala and the alley and the fraying cuff of his jacket. 3 months ago, Avery said quietly, more to herself than to him, Victor had 3 board allies. Martin Greer was running the CFO's office. Douglas Pratt had been embedded in this company's governance for 7 years, and I was walking into a car I didn't want to get into. She stopped. And then you came out of a service door. I was trying to get a cab, Ryan said. She looked at him. I know. Something passed through her face, not quite a smile, but the shape of one, without the careful management she usually applied. That's almost the best part of it, none. The weeks that followed were exactly what Avery had promised, managed, consequential, and not clean. The SEC notification went out within the required window. The financial press picked up the story 11 days later. Someone at the regulatory agency, or someone connected to one of the dismissed executives, had passed the outline of it to a reporter who covered corporate governance, and the resulting article was careful and factual and thorough in the way of reporting that doesn't need to editorialize because the facts are sufficient. The headline was not kind to Hartwell, but it was not kind to the people who had defrauded Hartwell either, which was the relevant distinction. Avery gave one statement, through Diane, that was 4 sentences long and contained no qualifications and no corporate language. It said the company had identified a fraud, had reported it, had taken immediate action, and would cooperate fully with all regulatory proceedings. It said the fraud had been discovered by internal risk management staff. Ryan's name was not in the statement, which was his preference, and which Avery had honored without making it a discussion. The board, in the weeks after the session, conducted itself the way boards conduct themselves when they've just had a significant scare, with pronounced attentiveness to governance procedures and a somewhat theatrical display of oversight that would settle back to normal levels in about 6 months. Ryan sat in on 3 additional audit committee meetings in the first month and watched Eleanor manage the board's anxiety with the practiced ease of someone who had seen this particular dance before. Douglas Pratt did not settle quietly. His attorney's initial approach, the mutually agreeable resolution framing, collapsed when the forensic team's full report was finalized in the 5th week, and the documented financial trail proved more direct than Pratt's team had apparently believed. the wire transfer records, the co-signatory documentation, the holding company's ownership structure. It was, as Eleanor had told Ryan it would be, airtight. Pratt's legal strategy shifted from settlement to challenge, which meant the litigation timeline stretched out toward the following year and beyond, which was the price of doing this properly and which Ryan had understood from the beginning. Martin Greer was named in a civil complaint filed by the company in the 6th week. 2 of the 3 regional directors reached plea agreements with federal prosecutors by month 3. The third fought it, which his attorney would eventually tell him was a mistake. Victor Hale, whose connection to the board fraud was indirect and unproven, but whose behavior at the gala was documented on hotel security footage, quietly withdrew from his minority stake position through a buyback arrangement that Diane had negotiated with his attorneys. He did not appear in the building again. Ryan did not think about him often, and when he did, it was briefly. Through all of it, the company kept running. That was the part that people outside corporate environments didn't always understand, that the operational machinery didn't pause for governance crises. Freight still moved. Regional operations still filed their reports. Clients still had logistics needs that needed managing, and the people doing that managing were the thousands of employees at Hartwell who had nothing to do with shell vendors or board fraud, and who showed up every day and did their work. Ryan found, to his own mild surprise, that this was the part he was best suited for. Not the crisis management, though he was competent at that, but the steady, methodical work of building the risk management structure that should have caught the fraud years earlier. He spent the better part of 4 months redesigning the vendor verification process, the sub-ledger review protocols, the approval chain documentation requirements. He hired 2 people for his team, a forensic accounting specialist named Janet, who had come from a regulatory agency and who could spot an irregular billing pattern in 30 seconds, and a younger analyst named Derek, who was meticulous in the way Ryan valued, and who asked better questions than most of the people twice his age on the executive floor. He trained them both the same way. Show me what the data actually says, not what it's supposed to say. It was a Tuesday evening in late November, 4 months after the board session, when the thing that had been building quietly between Ryan and Avery finally had a conversation, not dramatically. That would have been wrong for both of them. He'd stayed late. Emma was at a sleepover at her friend Lily's house, the first one she'd been to and the one she'd been talking about for 2 weeks. And he was finishing the revised vendor protocol documentation when he heard a knock on his open office door. Avery was in her coat. She was leaving for the night, which she did later than almost anyone else in the building, but which she did alone, usually without saying goodnight to anyone except Carol, who was long gone by this hour. She knocked on his open door, which she'd never done before. "You're still here," she said. "Emma's at a sleepover." Something moved through Avery's expression. "How's she doing with that?" She was extremely confident about it until about 6 o'clock, when she texted me to confirm that I had my phone on me. He paused. "She's fine. She just wanted to make sure the option existed." Avery's expression did the thing that had stopped being a surprise to Ryan. The genuine one, the unguarded one, that arrived when Emma came into the conversation. "Have you eaten?" she said. He looked at his desk, at the coffee cup that had been empty for 2 hours, at the granola bar wrapper that constituted his dinner. "Technically," he said. She looked at the wrapper. "Come on," she said. They went to a Thai place 3 blocks from the building that Avery said she ordered from occasionally, but it had never actually been inside, which Ryan found both entirely consistent with what he knew about her and also somehow sad in a way he didn't say out loud. The restaurant was small and warm, and not the kind of place anyone from Hartwell's executive floor was likely to walk into, which was probably why she'd chosen it. They sat at a table in the back. She ordered in a way that suggested she actually knew the menu, which contradicted what she'd said about never being inside. And Ryan let that go because it wasn't the conversation he was interested in having. The conversation he was interested in having took a while to arrive. They talked about the litigation timeline first, the safe ground, the professional overlay. Then about the team Ryan was building, about Janet and Derek, about a compliance process proposal that Ryan had been developing and that Avery wanted to review before the next board meeting. Work. The language they both moved through most fluently. Then the food came, and there was a pause in the conversation, and Avery looked at the table for a moment with the expression she wore when she was deciding something. I want to ask you something, she said, and I want you to know it's not a professional question. Ryan set down his fork. Okay. Why haven't you asked about the cargo ship? He looked at her. Of all the things he'd imagined she might say, that was not one of them. The model, she said. On my credenza. You've looked at it every time you've been in my office. You looked at it the first day and you've looked at it every time since. You've never asked. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't want to push past the point where you wanted to be. She held his gaze. That's either very considerate or very frustrating, and I haven't decided which. Both, probably. Something settled in her expression. It was my father's, she said, from the company he ran. He had a model of the first container ship he ever contracted freight space on, the Meridian Star, 1987. He kept it on his desk for 30 years. She paused. When he retired and cleared out his office, he gave it to me. He said I should put it somewhere I'd see it every day so I'd remember where the work came from. Ryan looked at her. He built something real with his hands and his time, and he trusted someone who used that trust to take from him, Avery said. And he survived it, and rebuilt, and retired without bitterness. She picked up her water glass. I've been trying to understand how he did that for about 15 years. The restaurant was quiet around them, the particular Tuesday night quiet of a place that isn't trying to be anything other than what it is. I think he understood that the person who did it had a deficiency, Ryan said. Not him. The deficiency was in Garrett, not in your father, for trusting him. Logically, yes, but trusting someone who steals from you feels like a failure of your own judgment. Or it feels like evidence that you were capable of trust in the first place. He paused. Which is not a small thing. She looked at him across the table. The look was direct and long and not managed in any of the ways he'd learned to watch for. You're going to tell me that being capable of trust is the part worth keeping, she said. I'm going to tell you that your father kept the company alive and raised a daughter who built something significantly larger than 3 trucks and a warehouse. He held her gaze. I think he figured out what mattered. She was quiet for a moment. Emma would like that argument, she said. Emma would tell you Pluto deserves to be a planet by the same logic. Avery looked at him with the expression that was no longer trying to be anything other than what it was. How does she do that? Do what? Find the right analogy for everything. She gets it from somewhere, Ryan said. I've stopped investigating where. Avery's expression became, finally, actually, the thing that had been building behind all the other expressions for months. Not quite a smile and not quite not one. Warm and real and directed at him without the distance that usually lived between them. It lasted longer than 3 seconds this time. He didn't look away. They walked back toward the building afterward, not because either of them had forgotten that they'd left their coats inside, but because the night was cold and clear and neither of them moved to get a cab. They walked the 3 blocks at the pace of people who aren't walking toward anything urgent, which was new for both of them and which neither of them commented on. Outside the building, they stopped. Ryan's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. Emma, from Lily's house. A text that said, "Are you awake?" And then, 3 seconds later, "Never mind, I'm fine." He typed back, "I'm awake. You okay?" And she sent back a thumbs up and a moon emoji, which he interpreted correctly as she was fine and slightly embarrassed she'd checked. He put his phone away. Avery had watched this without pretending not to. "She checked in," Ryan said. "She did." Avery paused. "She's going to be all right." "Yeah," he said, "she is." The street was quiet. A cab went by. Somewhere down the block, someone was walking a dog with determination, the dog considerably less determined than the walker. "I'm not very good at this," Avery said. Not an apology, a statement of inventory. Being present with people outside the building. I'm aware of how much of a habit the distance has become, and I'm not always sure I know how to operate without it. Ryan thought about that. "I'm not great at it either," he said. "I've been so focused on making sure Emma's okay that I stopped thinking about whether I was. I don't know how to be in a situation where I'm not calculating the risk to her." He paused. "That's not a small thing to unlearn." "No," she said, "it isn't." They stood on the sidewalk in front of a glass and steel building in Midtown Manhattan at 9:45 on a Tuesday night in November, 2 people who had gotten very good at operating alone, standing close enough that the distance between them was no longer the professional kind. "I think," Ryan said carefully, that this is a situation where neither of us is going to be very graceful about it. Probably not, Avery said, and that it's going to be complicated because of the building and the roles and the history. Definitely complicated, she agreed. And Emma. Emma is not a complication, Avery said. The precision of it, the absence of hesitation, landed somewhere in Ryan's chest before he had time to prepare for it. She is... Avery paused, searching for the word with the care of someone who wanted to get it exactly right. She is a reason for care. That's not a complication. Ryan was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said. It was not a romantic word. It was not a declaration or a promise or the kind of thing that would look good on paper later. But it was honest and it was real and it was what both of them had, and that turned out to be enough. The legal proceedings extended, as expected, into the following year. Douglas Pratt ultimately did not get the quiet resolution his attorney had sought. The holding company documentation was too direct, the wire transfer records too specific, and when the SEC's own investigation corroborated Eleanor's forensic team's findings in detail. The negotiating position Pratt had been counting on collapsed. He reached a settlement with the SEC in the spring that included disgorgement of the financial interest he'd held in the shell structure, a substantial civil penalty, and a lifetime bar from serving as an officer or director of any public company. His attorneys issued a statement describing it as a resolution that allowed their client to move forward, which was the kind of language that served its purpose and meant very little. Martin Greer's case moved through civil proceedings that were thorough and unglamorous, and concluded 14 months after his resignation with a judgment that covered the full scope of his participation in the fraud, plus damages. He did not go quietly, and his attorneys extended the process at every opportunity, which was their job and which changed nothing about where it ended. The three regional directors had varying outcomes that corresponded roughly to the degree of their participation and the quality of their legal representation. Two cooperated. One didn't. Ryan followed the proceedings carefully, but without the consuming attention he'd given them in the early months. Because by spring, he had enough distance from the investigation to understand that the legal process was doing what it was designed to do, and his vigilance wasn't required for it to function. Victor Hale disappeared from Hartwell's world with the efficiency of a man who had decided that continued proximity to the situation was not in his interest. Ryan heard his name once, in a conversation he was not part of that he walked past in a hallway, and then not again. Emma got into the advanced science program. The scholarship application had gone in through HR in December, processed through the independent committee the way Avery had described. Merit-based, no executive involvement. The acceptance letter came in March, and Emma read it at the kitchen table with the focused calm of someone who had believed this outcome was correct and was now receiving confirmation. Then she looked up at Ryan with an expression that was trying very hard not to be as overwhelmed as it was. "It's real," she said. "It's real," he said. She nodded once, in the way she had when she was processing something significant and needed a moment before she could say anything about it. Then she said, "Can we go to the syrup place?" "Right now?" "For dinner. We can get breakfast for dinner." Ryan thought there had probably never been a better reason to have pancakes at 6 in the evening, and told her so. At the syrup place, while Emma explained to him in precise detail what the program curriculum involved and which elements she was most interested in, and the specific questions she wanted to ask the program director on orientation day, Ryan sat across from her in the corner booth and thought about a night 4 months ago when he'd worn his one good suit to a company gala he hadn't wanted to attend, and had stepped out of a service door into an alley, and had made a choice that he hadn't known yet would reorganize everything. He thought about what Emma had said on the walk home that night. The thing about how if you didn't say anything, you were kind of helping them take it. 7 years old, and she'd put her finger on the moral center of it, with the directness that children applied to things before they learned to soften their conclusions for an audience. He thought about Avery's office the next morning, the cargo ship model on the credenza. The question, why didn't you keep walking? The honest answer, the one he'd given at the time, was still the honest answer. He hadn't been able to not step forward. It wasn't heroism. It was just the shape of who he was, built over years in dark places where the choice between action and inaction had consequences that mattered. He'd carried that shape into the ballroom, into the alley, into the job, into the investigation. He hadn't chosen the shape. He'd just lived in it long enough that it had become the only way he knew how to stand. What he hadn't known, standing at that service exit, was that stepping towards something difficult was also, sometimes, the direction that life was actually in. The changes happened gradually, the way real changes do. Not in a single conversation or a single moment, but in the accumulation of smaller ones. The Tuesday dinners that became a rhythm, the Saturday mornings when Avery started appearing at Emma's soccer games with the slightly startled expression of someone who has discovered they are present at a place they didn't fully plan to be, and found that they didn't mind. Emma, for her part, accepted Avery's presence with the pragmatic openness of a child who had been raised to assess people by what they actually did rather than what category they fell into. She asked Avery difficult questions with complete sincerity and accepted the answers with the same sincerity and filed everything away in the precise internal system she used for information she considered important. One Saturday in April, at the soccer field, Emma scored a goal from a difficult angle and looked immediately to the sideline. She found Ryan first, which was the habit of years. Then she found Avery standing beside him, and the look Emma gave them both, the small, satisfied look that lasted less than 2 seconds before she turned back to the game, was one that Ryan didn't fully have a word for, but that he recognized as the particular expression a child makes when the world has arranged itself in a way they find acceptable. He didn't say anything about it. Neither did Avery. They didn't need to. Ryan moved into a larger apartment in June. Not dramatically larger. 2 proper bedrooms instead of the wall-sharing arrangement. A kitchen that fit more than 2 people without requiring geometric precision. It was in the same neighborhood, 4 blocks from Mrs. Panagos and the syrup place and Emma's school, because the neighborhood was Emma's neighborhood, and he wasn't going to reorganize her geography for the sake of more square footage. The night he finished unpacking, Emma stood in the middle of her new bedroom with the rocket ship backpack at her feet and looked at the walls that were hers and that didn't share anything with anyone else's room, and said, "This is excellent." Ryan leaned against the doorframe and looked at her, looking at the room. "Yeah," he said. "It is." He thought about the 2-bedroom in Queens he'd been doing math around for 2 years. The calculations that had run quietly in the background of everything. Whether the numbers would hold, whether the margin was wide enough, whether one unexpected thing could bring the whole structure down. He'd lived with those calculations for so long that he'd stopped noticing the specific weight of carrying them. It was only now, when the weight was different, that he could feel what it had been. He wasn't naive about what stability meant. He knew it wasn't permanent and wasn't guaranteed, and that the future would have its own versions of alley exits and corrupted subledgers and things he couldn't calculate yet. He had a daughter who was going to grow up, and a company that would continue to produce problems, and a relationship that was real and complicated and still finding its shape. None of that was clean. None of it was going to be. But there was a difference between surviving something and living inside it, and Ryan Cole had spent a long time confusing the two. Avery came over for dinner for the first time in late June. Not a formal occasion, Emma had asked her directly, which Ryan had been both unsurprised by and slightly unprepared for, and Avery had said yes in the tone she used when she'd already been thinking about something and was waiting for the invitation to catch up to the thought. She arrived with wine she didn't need to bring, and a paperback book about the solar system that she'd bought, Ryan suspected, with a specific recipient in mind, and that she handed to Emma with the practiced neutrality of someone who did not want to make the gift a larger moment than it was. Emma looked at the book, looked at Avery. "You knew about my program," she said. "Your father mentioned it." "He talks about me at work?" "Frequently," Avery said. Emma appeared to process the significance of this with great satisfaction. She took the book to her room to put it with the stack she considered important, which Ryan knew from the geometry of that stack was the highest honor available in Emma's organizational system. Dinner was pasta that Ryan had made twice before successfully, and that came out slightly overcooked this time because he was distracted, which Emma noted clinically and Avery said was fine, and which Ryan accepted as the price of cooking while thinking about whether a person he valued was comfortable in his home. After Emma went to bed, later than usual, because she'd spent 40 minutes at the table asking Avery questions about running a company, about what decisions were hard, about whether being the boss meant you always had to have the answer, which Avery fielded with the honest directness she used when she found a question worth answering. Ryan and Avery sat at the kitchen table with the remains of the wine and the particular quiet of a home after a child has gone to sleep. She asked good questions, Avery said. She always does. She asked if I was ever afraid of being wrong. She looked at the table. I told her yes, fairly often. She seemed to find that reassuring. Ryan looked at her. She worries about being wrong. She's been doing it since she was 5. He paused. She doesn't let it stop her, but she worries about it. I told her that worrying about it was probably the best evidence that she was taking things seriously enough to get them right. Avery picked up her wine glass, held it without drinking. I'm not sure that's true across the board, but it's true enough for a 9-year-old. She's 7. She converses like 9, Avery said. Ryan didn't argue with that. The kitchen was quiet. The window was open and the June night came in, warm, with the specific quality of city air on a summer evening that was neither clean nor unpleasant, just present. Ryan could hear the traffic 2 blocks away, the rhythm of the neighborhood settling into its late-night pattern. I'm glad you came, he said. Avery looked at him. I wanted to, she said. I've been wanting to for a while. A beat. That's not easy for me to say. I know. I'm aware that I built a significant amount of infrastructure around not needing people, she said. I'm also aware that I'm sitting in your kitchen at 10 o'clock on a Thursday, having the best evening I've had in I don't know how long, and that the infrastructure is not serving the purpose it was designed for anymore. She paused. That's an uncomfortable thing to recognize. Yeah, he said. It is. I'm working on it. I know that too, he said. So am I. She looked at him for a long moment. The distance that had lived between them, the professional overlay, the careful management, the perimeter she maintained in every room she occupied, was not entirely gone and probably wouldn't be, because it was built from things that didn't simply dissolve because you recognized them. But it was different than it had been, permeable in places it hadn't been before. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She looked at their hands on the table. Then she looked at him. She didn't move away. There's a thing that people who have been through hard years tend to believe, and it goes something like this. Survival is the goal. Get through today and protect what matters, and keep the calculations running so that tomorrow is at least as stable as today. It's not a cynical belief. It's actually a disciplined and rational one, given what the world tends to offer people who are paying attention. Ryan had lived by it for years, and it had served him. It had kept Emma fed and housed and in a good school with a pediatrician she liked. But survival as a permanent orientation has a cost that's easy to miss because the cost is invisible. It's the life you don't quite live because you're always managing the next contingency. It's the morning you don't fully sit in because you're already calculating the afternoon. It's the person across the table whose face you notice, but whose meaning you defer, because meaning is a luxury for when the math is stable, and the math is never quite stable enough. Ryan had needed someone to step forward in an alley to understand that stepping forward was still something he was capable of. He hadn't needed saving from Victor Hale. He'd needed the reminder that the part of him that could act without calculating the cost first was still there, still functional, still worth trusting. Avery had needed something harder to name. She'd built the most rational possible response to a betrayal she'd watched her father absorb. Keep the perimeter tight, trust the work, let the results speak, and let the people stay at a manageable distance. It worked. It had worked for years, and it had built something real. But a life organized entirely around preventing a specific kind of pain is still a life organized around that pain, which means the pain is still in charge even when it's been successfully avoided. Emma had asked her if she was ever afraid of being wrong. The honest answer was, constantly. About decisions, about people, about the distance she'd maintained between herself and anyone who might have been worth the risk of closer proximity. She was afraid of being wrong about Ryan, which was probably why she'd hired him for reasons she could justify professionally, and then spent 3 months managing the awareness that the professional justification was not the whole story. What she was learning, slowly and without grace, was that the fear of being wrong was not a reason to stay at the perimeter. It was just a feeling, and feelings were information, and information was something she had always known what to do with. She was learning to do the same thing with this. They both were. The year turned, and Hartwell continued, and the legal proceedings ground through their necessary phases, and Emma started the advanced science program in September and came home from the first day talking for 40 minutes without pausing about the telescope they had access to, and a girl named Sophie who knew more about Jupiter's moons than anyone Emma had ever met, which Emma described as both impressive and challenging, which Ryan interpreted correctly as Emma had found her people. On a Saturday in October, 1 year and some weeks after a company gala that Ryan had attended in his one good suit and left through a service exit, he stood at the sideline of a soccer field in Queens while Emma played her fall season game, and Avery stood beside him with her hands in the pockets of a coat that was too nice for a soccer field and that she wore anyway, and the morning was cold and clear and exactly as ordinary as it was. Emma scored once. She looked to the sideline immediately afterward, the way she always did. She found both of them there, the way she'd learned she could. She turned back to the game. Ryan watched his daughter run and thought about the man who had stood in a service exit 11 months ago, calculating risk. That man had been careful and rational, and he'd been right to be those things. But he'd been doing it in a life that had contracted around the calculation, and he hadn't fully noticed the contraction because contraction happens slowly, and you don't feel it the same way you feel an acute wound. What had happened was not a clean story. There was no version of it without the alley, without the fraud, without the difficult months of building a case that could have gone wrong in several ways and that had required sustained attention under sustained pressure. There was no version without Emma's sleepover text and the overcooked pasta and the wine at the kitchen table and the long, uncomfortable work of two people learning to operate at a closer range than they'd each been comfortable with for a long time. It was not a story about rescue. Avery hadn't needed saving the way that word usually meant, and Ryan hadn't needed fixing. They were both people with specific damage from specific sources who had made reasonable adaptations and were now, slowly, revising those adaptations in the direction of something better. What Ryan understood, standing on that soccer field in October, was that the life worth waking up to wasn't the destination of a single good decision. It was the accumulation of days where you showed up and stayed present and didn't let the calculations crowd out the morning. It was Emma at the syrup place explaining Pluto's dignity. It was Avery at the kitchen table saying I wanted to in a voice that had cost her something. It was the ordinary weight of a cold October day and a child on a soccer field and a person beside you who had decided, imperfectly and without certainty, that this was worth the risk of being wrong. Ryan had stepped out of a service door into an alley and thought he was protecting someone. It turned out he was also finding the way back to his own life. That wasn't a lesson he could have planned for. It was just what happened when you stopped calculating long enough to move.